Timon presents audiobook collection, Leap of Faith by Søren Kierkegaard. For more audiobook, please subscribe and click the notification button below at Timpaxamor. Introduction. In the annals of my existence, between the years 1813 and 1855, I penned myriad texts, a testament to the fervor of a decade, the 1840s, when my quill seemed never to rest. Yet to tether my writings to a singular domain would be a disservice, for they span the vast expanse of philosophy, theology, devotion, literary critique, psychological introspection, and societal observation. I never sought to create a monolithic system. Instead, my method was inspired by the ancients, most profoundly by the inquisitive spirit of Socrates. Yet, my roots are undeniably anchored in the Christian tradition, drawing deeply from the biblical wellsprings and the profound Christian thinkers of old. Forewords, the trappings of dogma and the rigid confines of prescribed formulas. These are but man-made instruments, perhaps well-intentioned, but often misused, chaining one's divine endowments in perpetual infancy. The brave soul who dares cast aside these bindings might, for a time, stumble even over the smallest obstacles, unaccustomed as he is to unbridled freedom. It is a rare breed of man, those who, by nurturing their innermost faculties, tread with unwavering resolve. Yet, there remains hope for the masses to awaken from their slumber, to cast a discerning eye upon their own condition. Given but a taste of freedom, enlightenment is not just a possibility, but a near certainty. A handful of independent thinkers, even amongst those who deem themselves guardians of public thought, once they liberate themselves, will inevitably spread the ethos of valuing one's inherent worth and the sacred duty of independent thinking. A poignant irony emerges here. The very masses, once subdued by these guardians, eventually compel these guardians into acquiescence, often spurred by a subset of these guardians who remain ensnared in their own ignorance. Such is the treacherous nature of ingrained prejudices. They eventually turn upon their very creators or their progeny. The journey of collective enlightenment, thus, is one of gradual progress. While revolutions may topple tyrants and dispel oppressive regimes, they seldom reshape core beliefs. In the wake of old biases, newer ones often rise, serving as the reins for the ever-gullible masses. Abstract. In the intricate labyrinths of human existence, where via crucis meets via lucis, the leap of faith stands not merely as a guiding stella maris, but as a testament to the agape that draws the individual toward the ineffable mysteries of religious belief. This discourse endeavors to delve into the sanctified waters of that very leap, probing its foundation in the individual's confrontation with the paradoxes of belief, reason, and the eternal. In this opus, we shall endeavor to elucidate how amidst the tempests of doubt, the fervent spirit is beckoned to cast itself into the embrace of the divine. Concerns. As one stands poised on the precipice of existential angst, akin to Moses before the burning bush, facing the abyssus abyssum imbricated life's uncertainties and the weight of mysterium tremendum, a pivotal question emerges. Quo modo, amidst the shadows of doubt, does one find the audacity here I am? This is not simply an intellectual quaestio, but a calling of the soul, a yearning that seeks the sanctified heart of Abraham. The leap of faith, a term I humbly present, is not merely an ascent towards clarity, but a profound descensus ad inferos, a daring plunge into the paradoxical sanctum of existence. In this treatise, we shall embark on a pilgrimage through the annals of this leap, unveiling its essence, its challenges, and its indelible mark upon the core Christianum. As we tread this sacred path, we shall discern that this leap is neither an evasion of the veritas nor a fleeting memento mori, but a genuine embrace of the truths concealed beyond the scope of mere intellect, beckoning the fervent heart to ad maiorem Dei gloriam. In the wake of the Treaty of Vienna, the European canvas, having been torn asunder by Napoleonic ambitions, sought to paint a new visage of unity and peace. But, as quidquid recipitur ad modum recipientis recipitur suggests, what is received according to the mode of the receiver. This new diplomatic tapestry had unintended spiritual ramifications. The age found itself, like St. Peter on the water, oscillating between faith and doubt amidst turbulent seas. Within the intricate modus operandi of political realignment, a spiritual desideratum emerged, casting shadows on the foundational stones of Christendom. Amidst the murmurs of monarchies restored and the murmured prayers in cathedrals, the individual Christian felt the weight of the Apostle Paul's declaration, omnia vincit ama, love conquers all. It beckoned them to discern between mere lex orandi, law of prayer, and the profound depths of lex credendi, law of belief. For the believers of this era, teetering on the precipices of old certainties and new societal constructs, the call was clear: to make an audacious leap of faith. This wasn't a mere retreat to the Via Antiqua, but an ardent actus fide into the abyss of genuine belief, reminiscent of Abraham's trust on Mount Moriah. As Europe reconstructed its external edifices, Kierkegaard's clarion call was for the soul to reforge its covenant with the eternal. Solidified by faith alone, the believer was reminded to anchor their essence not to the fleeting sands of earthly realms, but to the unchanging rock of ages. In this age, where the status quo was more transient than ever, the leap of faith served as a beacon, illuminating the path for the faithful amidst the fog of temporal recalibrations. The disciple. When the disciple is in a state of error, And unless we are referring to Socrates, yet remains a human being and receives the condition and the truth, he doesn't become human for the first time, for he was already human. However, he transforms, not frivolously becoming another individual of the same quality, but emerging as a being of a different quality. We might call him a new creature. While in error, he constantly deviated from the truth. But upon receiving the condition, the direction of his life shifts. We can term this shift conversion. This word, though not commonly used in this context, aptly describes the change we're discussing and helps avoid ambiguity. If the learner's error resulted from his own fault, this conversion cannot occur without him recognizing that his prior state was due to his guilt. With this realization, he departs from his past. But parting always brings a tinge of sadness. In this scenario, the sorrow emerges from the time he spent in his previous state. We can name this feeling repentance. After all, isn't repentance a form of saying goodbye, where one looks back to hasten forward? When the learner was in error and then accepts the truth, an inner transformation akin to transitioning from non-existence to existence occurs. This shift resembles birth. While an existing person cannot be reborn, the disciple experiences rebirth. We can term this transformation new birth. As a result, the disciple enters the world anew, reminiscent of the initial birth, unfamiliar with the world and its inhabitants. While mass baptisms are feasible, mass new births aren't. Much like someone who discovers himself through Socratic guidance forgets the world, the reborn disciple forgets himself in recognizing his divine teacher. If the moment possesses pivotal importance, if it doesn't, our speech remains Socratic regardless of our claims of surpassing the wisdom of Socrates, then a rift is created, preventing a return to the past. The disciple won't relish in recollection's memories, nor will he muster the strength to bring God to his side again. In the vast expanse of human existence, where reason and logic often dictate our paths, there emerges a profound paradox that I grapple with deeply: the leap of faith. It is not a calculated step based on evidence or empirical knowledge. Rather, it's a dive into the unknown, a commitment to something beyond the grasp of human intellect. One might say, it's an embrace of the absurd, a conscious choice to believe when everything might suggest otherwise. This leap, my friends, transcends mere cognition. It's a passionate affirmation, a deep-seated conviction that even amidst doubt, there is truth to be found. But is the hypothesis here expounded thinkable? Let us not be in haste to reply, for not only one whose deliberation is unduly prolonged may fail to produce an answer, but also one who, while he exhibits a marvelous promptitude in replying, does not show the desirable degree of slowness in considering the difficulty before explaining it. Before we reply, let us ask ourselves from whom we may expect an answer to our question. The being born, is this fact thinkable? Certainly, why not? But for whom is it thinkable, for one who is born, or for one who is not born? This latter supposition is an absurdity which could never have entered anyone's head, for one who is born could scarcely have conceived the notion. When one who has experienced birth thinks of himself as born, he conceives this transition from non-being to being. The same principle must also hold in the case of the new birth. Or is the difficulty increased by the fact that the non-being which precedes the new birth contains more being than the non-being which preceded the first birth? But who then may be expected to think the new birth? Surely the man who has himself been born anew, since it would of course be absurd to imagine that one not so born should think it. Would it not be the height of the ridiculous for such an individual to entertain this notion? If a human being is originally in possession of the condition for understanding the truth, he thinks that God exists in and with his own existence. But if he is in error, he must comprehend this fact in his thinking, and recollection will not be able to help him further than to think just this. Whether he is to advance beyond this point the moment must decide, although it was already active in giving him an insight into his error. If he does not understand this, we must refer him to Socrates, though through being obsessed with the idea that he has advanced far beyond this wise man, he may cause him many a vexation, like those who were so incensed with Socrates for taking away from them one or another stupid notion, that they actually wanted to bite him. Theaetetus 151. In the moment man becomes conscious that he is born, for his antecedent state, to which he may not cling, was one of non-being. In the moment man also becomes conscious of the new birth, for his antecedent state was one of non-being. Had his preceding state in either instance been one of being, the moment would not have received decisive significance for him, as has been shown above. While then the pathos of the Greek consciousness concentrates itself upon recollection, the pathos of our project is concentrated upon the moment. And what wonder, for is it not a most pathetic thing to come into existence from non-being? There you have my project. But I think I hear someone say, this is the most ridiculous of all projects, or rather, you're of all projectors of hypotheses the most ridiculous. For even when a man propounds something nonsensical, it may still remain true that it is he who has propounded it, but you behave like a Lazarone who takes money for exhibiting premises open to everybody's inspection. You are like the man who collected a fee for exhibiting a ram in the afternoon, which in the forenoon could be seen gratis, grazing in the open field. Perhaps it is so. I hide my head in shame. But assuming that I am as ridiculous as you say, let me try to make amends by proposing a new hypothesis. Everybody knows that gunpowder was invented centuries ago, and in so far it would be ridiculous of me to pretend to be the inventor. But would it be equally ridiculous of me to assume that somebody was the inventor? Now I am going to be so polite as to assume that you are the author of my project. Greater politeness than this you can scarcely ask. Or if you deny this, will you also deny that someone is the author, that is to say, some human being? In that case I am as near to being the author as any other human being. So that your anger is not vented upon me because I appropriated something that belongs to another human being, but because I appropriated something of which no human being is the rightful owner, and hence your anger is by no means appeased when I deceitfully ascribe the authorship to you. Is it not strange that there should be something such in existence, in relation to which everyone who knows it knows also that he has not invented it, and that this passed me by, neither stops nor can be stopped even if we ask all men in turn? This strange fact deeply impresses me, and casts over me a spell, for it constitutes a test of the hypothesis, and proves its truth. It would certainly be absurd to expect of a man that he should of his own accord discover that he did not exist. But this is precisely the transition of the new birth, from non-being to being. That he may come to understand it afterwards can make no difference, for because a man knows how to use gunpowder and can resolve it into its constituent elements, it does not follow that he has invented it. Be then angry with me and with whoever else pretends to the authorship of this thought, but that is no reason why you should be angry with the thought itself. Regarding the sequel, on the other hand, I am convinced, and I don't quite know whether it flatters anyone for me to say so, that any theology graduate will be capable of writing it, provided, that is, that he is capable of reproducing the unflinching positions and movements of the dialectic. Such being the nature of the promise of the sequel, it seems fitting that its fulfillment be made in a postscript, and very far from being the case that the author, should there otherwise be any importance in the whole thing, can be accused of anything so womanly as saying what is most important in a postscript. Essentially, there is no sequel. In another sense, the sequel could become endless in proportion to the learning and erudition of the one who invested the problem with a historical costume. All honor to learning and knowledge, praise be to the person who masters the material with the surety of knowledge and the reliability of personal observation. It is nevertheless the dialectic that is the nerve in the problem. If the problem does not become clear dialectically, but on the contrary exceptional learning and great acumen are expended on the detail, the problem becomes only more and more difficult for someone dialectically interested. No one can deny that in terms of thorough erudition, critical acumen and skill in bringing order, much that is excellent concerning this problem has been achieved by those for whom the present author feels deep respect, and whose guidance he wished in his student days that he could have followed with more talent than he possesses, until with mixed feelings of admiration for the eminence and despondency in his own forsaken, doubting distress, he believed he had discovered that, in spite of these excellent efforts, the problem was not being advanced but pushed back. Thus, if naked dialectical reflection shows there is no approximation, that to want to quantify oneself into faith along this path is a misunderstanding, a delusion, that wanting to concern oneself with such considerations is a temptation that the believer must resist with all his might, preserving himself in the passion of faith, for fear of succeeding, N.B. by giving into a temptation, that is, by greatest ill luck, in transforming faith into something else, into another form of certainty, substituting probability and guarantees, these being exactly what was scorned when, at the start, he made the qualitative transition of the leap from unbeliever to believer. If this is how it is, then anyone need unfamiliar with learned scholarship nor bereft of a willingness to learn, and who has seen it in this way, he too will have felt hard-pressed when admiration in the face of those distinguished by learning, acumen and well-merited renown led him to think meanly of himself and of his own insignificance, so that he kept on coming back to them time and again, seeking the fault in himself, and when, despondently, he had to admit that he was in the right. Dialectical fearlessness is not easily attained. The feeling of abandonment, even when believing oneself to be right, and parting from trusted mentors in admiration, marks its essence. The relationship to the dialectical person, introduced here, is akin to that with an orator. The orator seeks the freedom to speak, to coherently express his ideas, while the listener, eager to learn, desires the same. The orator, gifted in rhetoric and understanding human passions, speaks with compelling imagery and employs elements of fear at decisive moments. He captivates the listener, who gets lost in the narrative, filling with admiration for the eloquent speaker. The listener's heart races, their soul stirred. The orator, with earnestness and passion, demands silence for any objections, and places his case before the omniscient. He challenges anyone to deny the truth, a truth which only a profoundly misguided individual could contest. He cautions against doubting, emphasizing that the real danger lies in succumbing to such temptations. He comforts the anxious soul, soothing their fears with tender reassurances. Yet the despondent dialectician returns home, recognizing that the problem wasn't addressed, let alone solved, but lacks the strength to challenge the persuasive orator. Once the dialectician breaks free from the orator's influence, a systematic philosopher appears, asserting that clarity will come only at the end of speculation. So, patience is required before voicing dialectical doubts. Surprisingly, the same philosopher admits that the system isn't yet complete. The dialectician realizes that clarity is promised at the end, but the end hasn't arrived. However, true dialectical fearlessness still eludes him. Such fearlessness would enable him to ironically smile at such propositions, especially when the philosopher offers vast escape routes, for it's absurd to claim completion when the conclusion is absent. If the system lacks a conclusion at the end, it was also missing at the beginning. This should then have been said at the start. You may indeed complete a house even if it lacks a bell pull, but in a scientific structure the lack of a conclusion has retroactive power to make the beginning doubtful and hypothetical, i.e. unsystematic. So much for dialectical fearlessness. But it is something a dialectician has still to acquire. Accordingly, in youthful modesty he refrains from drawing any conclusion respecting the absence of a conclusion, and he begins, putting hope in the work. So he reads, and he is amazed. He is riveted in admiration. He yields to the superior power. He reads and reads. He grasps something. But above all, he puts his hope in the clarifying reflection that the conclusion will cast over the whole. And he finishes the book, but without finding the problem presented. And yet the young dialectician has all the swinging enthusiasm of youth's trust in the person of renown. Yes, like a young girl who has but a single wish, to be loved by just one, so has he but one wish, to be a thinker. And alas, it is in this renowned person's power to decide his fate. For if the youth does not understand him, he is rejected, he has been shipwrecked on his single wish. And just for that reason he dare not yet confide in anyone else and initiate him into his misfortune, his disgrace, the fact that he cannot understand the famous man. So he starts afresh. He translates all the more important passages into his mother tongue, to be sure that he understands them and is not overlooking anything and thus possibly something about the problem, because that it should simply not be there is something he cannot at all understand. He learns much of it by heart. He makes an outline of the argument, takes it with him everywhere, pondering it. He tears it in pieces and makes a new one. What will one not do for the sake of one single wish? He comes to the end of the book a second time, but no nearer the problem. So he buys a new copy of the same book, so as not to be put off by discouraging memories, travels to foreign parts in order to begin with renewed energy, and what then? He learns to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, to the renowned person his admiration, but also to keep hold of his problem in spite of all celebrities. The scholarly introduction distracts through its erudition, and the impression is given that the problem presents itself just when the scholarly learning reaches its maximum, i.e., as if the learned and critical effort towards completion were the same as that of getting to the problem. The rhetorical lecture distracts by intimidating the dialectician. The systematic direction promises everything and holds on to nothing at all. Along these paths the problem thus fails to emerge, especially along the systematic. For the system presupposes faith as something given. It further supposes that canisters faith in grasping itself in some other way than that of remaining in the passion of faith, which is a presupposition for a system that has no presuppositions, and one that insults faith, a presupposition that shows precisely that faith has never been something given. The system's presupposition that faith is given dissolves into a conceit into which the system has deluded itself, that it knew what faith is. The problem posed in that piece, without pretending to have solved it, since it wanted simply to pose it, went like this. Can there be a historical point of departure for an eternal consciousness? How can such a thing be of more than historical interest? Can one base an eternal consciousness on historical knowledge? Cf. the title page. It was said in the piece itself, as is well known, Christianity is the only historical phenomenon which, in spite of the historical, indeed precisely by means of the historical, has wanted to be the single individual's point of departure for his eternal consciousness, has wanted to interest him more than just historically, has wanted to base his happiness on his relation to something historical. 7. Thus, what is asked about in the problem in its historical costume is Christianity. The problem is now relative to Christianity. Put less problematically in the form of a treatise, the problem would go as follows. On the apologetic presuppositions of faith, transitions and approaches to faith by approximation, the quantifying introduction to the decision of faith. What would then be treated are numerous considerations that are being, or have been discussed by theologians in the propedeutic to exegesis, 8 in the introduction to dogmatics, and in apologetics. So as not to cause confusion, however, it must be immediately borne in mind that the problem is not about the truth of Christianity, but about the individual's relation to Christianity, that is, not about the indifferent individual's systematic eagerness to arrange the truths of Christianity in sections 9, but about the infinitely interested individual's concern regarding his own relation to such a teaching. Putting it as plainly as possible, to make use of myself experimentally, I, Johannes Climacus, born in this city and now 30 years old, a quite ordinary human being just like anyone else, assume that for me, as much as for a serving maid and the professor, there awaits the highest good called an eternal happiness. I have heard that Christianity contracts to provide one with that good. And now I ask, how do I enter into relation with this doctrine? What unsurpassed effrontery, I hear some think to say, what frightful vanity in this world historically concerned age, this theocentric age, the speculatively significant 19th century, to dare lay such stress on one's own little self. I shudder inwardly. If I had not steeled myself against sundry terrors, I would no doubt slink away quietly with my tail between my legs. But my conscience is quite clear in this matter. It is not I who in myself have become so impudent, it is precisely Christianity that obliges me to be so. It places a quite different sort of weight on my own little I, and on every rather little I, since it wants to make him eternally happy if he is fortunate enough to enter into it. That is, without having understood Christianity, since I merely posed the question, I have nevertheless grasped this much, that it wants to make the single individual eternally happy, and that it presupposes precisely in the individual himself this infinite interest in his blessedness as conditio sine qua non, an interest by virtue of which he hates father and mother 11 and doubtless also cares less about speculative systems and world historical outlines. Although an outsider, this much I have grasped, that the only unpardonable lese majeste against Christianity is for the individual to take his relationship to it for granted. However unassuming it may seem, being thrown in with everything in this way, it is exactly this that Christianity considers impudence. I must therefore most respectfully decline all theocentric helpers and the assistance of helpers in helping me into Christianity in that way. I would rather stay where I am, with my infinite interest, with the problem, with the possibility. For it is not entirely impossible that someone who is infinitely interested in his own eternal happiness may sometime become eternally happy. On the other hand, it is surely quite impossible for someone who has lost that sense, and it can hardly be anything but an infinite concern, to become eternally happy. Yes, once lost it is perhaps impossible to regain. Those 5 foolish maidens, they had lost expectation's infinite passion. So the lamp went out. Then the cry arose that the bridegroom was coming. They ran to the dealer and bought new oil, wanting to start afresh and let everything be forgotten. And everything was indeed forgotten. The door was shut and they were left outside, and when they knocked on the door the bridegroom said, I do not know you. 12. This was no mere jibe on the bridegroom's part, but a sober truth, because by losing the infinite passion they had in a spiritual sense made themselves strangers. The objective problem will then be about Christianity's truth. The subjective problem is about the individual's relation to Christianity. Quite simply, how can I, Johannes Climacus, share in the happiness that Christianity promises? The problem concerns only me by myself, partly because if properly posed it will concern each in the same way, and partly because all the others have faith already as something given, as a trifle they do not even think very highly of, or as a trifle that only amounts to something when tricked out with some proofs. So the posing of the problem is not presumption on my part, but only a kind of madness. To make my problem clear, I shall first pose the objective problem and show how this is dealt with. This will give the historical aspect its due. I shall then proceed to pose the subjective problem. It is really more than the promised sequel as the investing of the problem with its historical costume, since the historical costume is given merely by citing the one word, Christianity. The first part is the promised sequel, the second a renewed attempt on the same lines as the piece, a new approach to the problem at the crumbs. 2. On the Church, the protection that the visible presence of the Pope provides the Catholic Church against the intrusion of dialectics we will omit from the discussion. F. But the Church has also been seized on within Protestantism, once it had abandoned the Bible as the securer course. Although attacks are still leveled against the Bible, and although learned theologians defend it linguistically and critically, this whole procedure is in part antiquated. And above all, precisely because people are becoming more and more objective, they no longer have the decisive conclusions up their sleeves. Letter zealotry, which at least possessed passion, has vanished. That it had passion was its merit. In another sense it was comic, and just as the age of chivalry really comes to a close in Don Quixote, for the comic interpretation is always the concluding one, so might a poet, by comically immortalizing such an unhappy servant of the letter in his tragicomic romanticism, still make it plain that literal theology is a thing of the past. For wherever there is passion there is also romanticism, and anyone who has a bent and a sense for passion, and has not learned simply by heart to know what poetry is, will be able to see a beautiful infatuation in such a figure, just like when a girl in love embroiders the finely wrought frame for the gospel in which she reads of her love's joy, just like when a girl in love counts the characters in the letter he has written to her. But then he would also see the comedy. Such a figure would certainly be laughed at, but with what justification is another matter. That the whole age has become devoid of passion is no warrant for laughter. What was laughable about the zealot was that his infinite passion fell upon a wrong object, an approximation object. The good in him was that he had passion. F. The infinite reflection, in which alone the subject's concern for his eternal happiness can realize itself, has in all just one distinguishing mark, that the dialectical accompanies it everywhere. Be it a word, a proposition, a book, a man, a society, or whatever, as soon as it is supposed to form a limit in a way in which the limit is not itself dialectical, it is superstition and narrow-mindedness. There is always in a human being some such concern, at once complacent and concerned, a wish to lay hold of something so really fixed that can exclude the dialectical, but this is cowardice and treason towards the divine. Even the most certain of all things, a revelation, ipso becomes dialectical when I am to appropriate it. Even the most fixed of things, the infinite negative result that is the infinite form of God's presence in the individual, at once becomes dialectical. As soon as I take away the dialectical, I become superstitious and cheat God of each moment's strenuous reacquisition of what was once acquired. On the other hand, it is far more comfortable to be objective and superstitious, and bragging about it, and proclaiming thoughtlessness. This turn that the matter has taken, letting go of the Bible and laying hold of the Church, is even a Danish idea. However, I am unable to bring myself either to rejoice on my fellow countrymen's behalf over this matchless discovery, as it is officially called among the geniuses in question, the inventor and Messrs. admirers, or to consider it desirable for the authorities to commission a Te Deum from the whole nation in devout thanksgiving for the matchless discovery. It is better, and at least for me indescribably easy, to let Grundtvig keep what is his, the matchless discovery. It was indeed whispered at one time, especially when a similar little movement began in Germany with Delbruck, etc., that Grundtvig really owed the idea to Lessing, without however owing him its matchlessness, so that Grundtvig's merit would consist in having transformed a small Socratic bone of contention, submitted with skill and judgment, with rare skeptical expertise and subtle dialectic as something to ponder, into an eternal, matchless, world-historical, absolute, glaring and crystal-clear truth. But even supposing there was some connection on Pastor Grundtvig's part, which I myself don't at all assume since, in its matchless absoluteness, the matchless discovery does bear the unmistakable stamp of Grundtvigian originality, it would still be unjust to call it a borrowing from Lessing, since in all that is Grundtvigian there is not the least thing that reminds one of Lessing, or anything which that grand master of understanding could lay claim to without matchless resignation. Had it only been intimated that the clever and dialectical Magister Lindbergh, the matchless discovery's talented chief advocate and defender, might owe something to Lessing, that would have been worth listening to. The discovery in any case owes much to Lindbergh's talent, in so far as it was by his efforts that it took on form, was pressed into a dialectical posture, became less afflicted with hiatus, less matchless, and more accessible to sound common sense. What Grundtvig had rightly seen was that the Bible could not possibly hold out against the intrusive doubt. But he had failed to realize that the reason was that attack and defense are both part of an approximating which, in its incessantly continued striving, lacked the dialectic for an infinite decision on which one bases an eternal happiness. Since he lacked dialectical awareness of this, it must have been by a sheer stroke of luck that he actually found himself outside the presuppositions within which the Bible theory has its great merit, has its venerable scholarly significance. But a stroke of luck is unthinkable in relation to the dialectical. As for that, it was more likely that with his church theory he would come to stay within the same presuppositions. Abusive language directed at the Bible, with which he at one time really offended the older Lutherans, abusive and dictatorial language instead of thoughts, can naturally only, and that to an extraordinary degree, satisfy devotees. Everyone else can easily see that when thought is lacking in the din of the discourse, it is thoughtlessness that is giving vent to itself in this loose way of talking. Just as previously the Bible was to decide objectively what is Christian and what is not, so now the Church is supposed to serve as the safe objective recourse. More specifically, again, it is the living word in the Church, the confession of faith, and the word with the sacraments. Now, for the first time, it is clear that the problem is to be dealt with objectively. The modest, immediate, wholly unreflective subjectivity remains naively convinced that if only the objective truth stands fast, the subject is already and primed to put it on. Here, straight away, we see the youthfulness, something on which the old Grundtvig so prides himself, but has no inkling of that subtle little Socratic secret, that the crux is exactly the relationship of the subject. If the truth is spirit, then the truth is a taking to heart, not an immediate and utterly unconcerned relationship of an immediate Geist to a sum of propositions, even if, to compound the confusion, the name given to the relationship is that of the most decisive expression of subjectivity, faith. Unrelatedness is always directed outwards, over towards something, over against it, in its striving towards the goal, the objective. The Socratic secret, which if Christianity is not to be an infinite step backwards can only be infantized in the latter through a deeper inwardness, is that the movement is inwards, that the truth is the subject's transformation in himself. The prophetic genius who envisages so matchless a future for Greece just does not know the Greek spirit. A study of Greek skepticism is much to be recommended. There one learns excellently what will always require time and exercise and discipline to understand, narrow paths for unshowy language. That the certainty of sense perception, to say nothing of historical certainty, is uncertainty, is only an approximation, and that the positive and an immediate relation to it are the negative. The first dialectical difficulty with the Bible is that it is a historical document, that as soon as it is made the recourse, an introductory approximation begins and the subject is distracted in a parenthesis whose conclusion one can await in eternity. The New Testament is something of the past and is thus historical in the stricter sense. Just that is the source of the befuddlement that prevents the problem becoming subjective and treats it objectively, so that it altogether fails to arise. The philosophical crumbs bear in on this difficulty in chapters 4 and 5 by cancelling the difference between the contemporary disciple and the latest disciple, who are presumed separated by 1,800 years. This is of importance, in case the problem, the contradiction that God has existed in human form, be confused with the history of the problem, i.e., with the summa summarum of 1,800 years' opinions, etc. It was in this experimental manner that the crumbs brought the problem into relief. The difficulty with the New Testament as something from the past appears now to be obviated in the case of the Church, which is indeed something in the present. On this point, Grundtvig's theory has merit. Lindbergh in particular has developed, with competent juristic acumen, the thought that the Church cuts away all the proving and demonstrating needed in connection with the Bible, since that is something from the past, whereas the Church is there, something in the present. To demand that it prove it is there, 21 says Lindbergh quite correctly, is nonsense, just as it is to ask a living man to prove he is this here. Lindbergh is wholly in the right and deserves credit for the unwavering and clarifying assurance with which he is able to stick to something. The Church, then, is there, and from the Church, the something in the present, is contemporary with the inquirer, so that the problem acquires the right of equality of contemporaneity. One may learn what is essentially Christian, since that is what the Church professes. The reason for this, in the realm of dialectical metaphysics, is that the existence of something is superior to any proof of its existence, making it therefore foolish to ask for proof. Conversely, to infer from essence to existence involves a leap. Quite right, but not even Lindbergh has managed to maintain the argument to this level, and I'd rather engage with a dialectician, leaving the incomparable Grundtvig aside. After asserting that the Church exists and that one can learn what Christianity is from the Church, it is further claimed that this Church, in its current form, is the apostolic Church. This Church is deemed to have persisted for 18 centuries. Labeling it Christian is more than a contemporary tag. When applied to the present, it implies a historical lineage akin to that of the Bible. This argument then falls apart. The only historical aspect that is superior to proof is contemporary existence. Any reference to the past requires evidence. Thus, if someone tells a man to prove his current existence, the latter can rightfully retort, that's nonsense. But if he claims to have existed 400 years ago, essentially unchanged, the demand for proof is valid. It's perplexing that a dialectician as adept as Lindbergh, known for his precise conclusions, has overlooked this. The moment we emphasize continuity using living words, we revert to the original stance of the Bible theory. Objections can be likened to a relentless specter. One might relocate or avoid it, but the specter follows. Sometimes an illusion momentarily triumphs. By suddenly adjusting the strategy and fortuitously avoiding new critiques, a genius like Grundtvig might blissfully believe that, thanks to his unparalleled discovery, all issues are resolved. But subject the Church theory to the same scrutiny the Bible theory endured, and let all objections target it. What's the result? We'll discover, consistently, that a preparatory discipline becomes essential, tasked with proving the confession of faith's primitive nature and its consistent meaning throughout 18 centuries. Here, critics will encounter challenges unknown to the Bible theory. For clarity, I must reiterate a dialectical point. While it's conceivable that someone, understanding the magnitude of these challenges, might argue the Bible approach works better, we shouldn't become so distracted that we forget this comparison lies within the inherent imperfection of an approximation. It's incommensurate with any decision about eternal happiness. There will then be a search through old books. It's evident that the living word cannot assist us. Explaining this to Grundtvig, as I do here, holds little hope. I'm enveloped in a pervasive mood of hopelessness. The living word asserts that the Church exists. Undoubtedly, even Satan cannot dispute this. However, the living word does not claim that the Church has existed for 18 centuries, or that it remains essentially unchanged. Even a beginner in dialectics can discern this. The living word epitomizes the immediate, unquestionable existence of the contemporary present. Yet, it cannot pertain to the past, as its essence implies only an immediate presence. The past requires evidence. Proclaiming a Grundtvigian curse upon those who might not grasp the significant influence of the living word concerning historical pastness won't prove Grundtvig's insight or discredit the opposing view. It is Magister Lindbergh himself, possessing too astute a mind to merely sound repetitive alarms, who has steered the matter in this direction. Once, during a debate over the correct phrasing, whether to say, I believe in a Christian church, or I believe that there is a Christian church, he consulted ancient texts to determine when the incorrect version emerged. This is the logical course of action, unless one wishes to introduce a new renunciation to the Christian creed, effectively forfeiting all genuine thought in deference to the unparalleled discovery and the mysticism of the living word. This approach instigates a renewed process of approximation. Its end remains unpredictable. This method continues indefinitely, always approximating without a definite conclusion. The Church theory's advantage over the Bible theory was its ability to negate subsequent history, converting the historical into the present. However, this advantage dissipates when we consider more detailed provisions. Other assertions regarding the merits of the confession of faith over the Bible, especially as a defense against critiques, are somewhat odd, but no one whose imagination is not entirely paralyzed, if he should happen to recall this polemic, will deny that Lindbergh's behavior brought quite vividly to mind the erudite exertions of a worried biblical exegete. However, I have never been able to find anything sophistical in Lindbergh's behavior, provided, as is only fair and just, one does not presume to judge infallibly the secrets of the heart, a kind of judgment that has always haunted Lindbergh. Obscure. That the Bible is a big book and the articles of the confession only a few propositions is an illusory comfort and really only works for people who have not discovered that prolix thought does not always match prolix words. And the opponents need only shift the point of attack, i.e., level it on the articles of the confession, and then everything is in full swing. If, to support the denial of the personality of the Holy Spirit, the opponents can try their hand at New Testament exegesis, they can just as easily draw on the distinction that Lindbergh himself has discussed exegetically, whether we should read the Holy Spirit or the Holy Spirit. This but by way of an example, for it goes without saying that it is impossible with historical problems to reach an objective decision so certain that no doubt could find its way in. This too shows that the problem is to be put subjectively, and that it is nothing but a misunderstanding to seek an objective assurance, and in that way avoid the risk in which passion chooses and continues to reaffirm its choice. It would also be a huge injustice should any later generation be able safely, that is objectively, to enter Christianity and thus secure a share in what the first who did so had bought in subjectivity's direst mortal danger and had acquired, subject to the same danger, through a long life. Anyone who wants to say that the briefer statement is easier to keep a hold on and harder to attack is holding something back, namely how many thoughts are contained in the briefer declaration. As for that, someone else might then say, with equal justice, that the wordier statement, when as in case both derive from the same, here the apostles, is clearer and thus easier to hold on to and more difficult to attack. But everything that is said in this direction, pro et contra, is again only the skepticism of approximation. The church theory has been widely lauded as objective, a term that, in our age, is often viewed as a commendation with which thinkers and prophets believe they honor one another. It's regrettable that in the realms where objectivity is paramount, such as in strict scientific disciplines, it is rarely achieved. Truly knowledgeable scholars, intimately familiar with their fields, are a rarity. Conversely, when it comes to Christianity, objectivity becomes an ill-fitted category. Anyone who holds only an objective perspective on Christianity is, by that very stance, essentially pagan. Christianity is deeply rooted in spirit, subjectivity, and inwardness. I don't dispute the objective nature of the church theory. Rather, I'll demonstrate it with the following example. When you position an individual, one passionately and infinitely concerned about their eternal salvation, in relation to this theory, hoping to base their happiness upon it, they become a figure of absurdity. This comedic perception is not due to their passionate interest, for this is their virtue. It arises because the objectivity of the theory doesn't align with their profound concerns. If the historical attributes of the confession, its apostolic origins, etc., are deemed crucial, then every single detail becomes vitally significant. However, this can only be approached through approximation. This places the individual in a paradox. They aim to anchor their eternal happiness through it, yet cannot do so because the approximation is never complete. Hence, they'll never fully tether their eternal happiness to it, only a less intense sentiment. If the consensus shifts to favor the confession of faith over the scriptures, we would witness phenomena analogous to the fervor of the anxious biblical exegete. The individual's tragic passion becomes comedic when juxtaposed against an approximate object. If one emphasizes the sacrament of baptism, rooting one's eternal joy in the fact of being baptized, they again appear comical. Not because their profound passion is laughable, on the contrary, it's commendable, but because the object of this passion is merely approximate. We live comfortably with the knowledge that we're baptized. But if baptism becomes the definitive factor for one's eternal salvation, then one, unless they've reached an objective bliss and dismissed passion as a youthful folly, must seek certainty. The challenge lies in that, concerning a historical fact, all one can attain is approximation. Family testimonies, parish records, certificates, all offer reassurance. But let someone possess enough passion to fully grasp the weight of their eternal joy, and then let them attempt to pin it solely on their baptism. They will face despair. If the church theory had wielded significant influence and everything hadn't become so objective, it would have directly spurred the Baptist movement or led to the repetition of baptismal rites, akin to Holy Communion, simply to establish certainty. The topics to be considered under this and the next item can be referred more definitely to Lessing in that the respective proposition can be cited directly, yet again with no straightforward certainty, since Lessing is not didactic but subjectively evasive, not wishing to pledge anyone to accept his view for his sake, or trying to help others establish a direct continuity with the source. Perhaps Lessing has himself understood that such things cannot be put across directly. At least his procedure can be explained in this way, and the explanation is possibly right, possibly. Lessing has said, SW 5th volume, pages 80, that accidental historical truths can never become evidence of eternal truths of reason, and also, page 83, that the transition whereby one will build an eternal truth on a historical account is a leap. I shall now look at these two propositions rather more closely, and place them in the context of that problem of the crumbs. Can one base an eternal happiness on historical knowledge? But here I would first like to make room for an observation that can help to show how deceptive people's thinking is, like the reading of the pupil who pretends to be reading and isn't reading all the same. when two thoughts are inseparably related to each other, so that anyone able to think the one can ipso think the other, it is not uncommon for an opinion to pass from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation. That makes it easy to think the one thought, while an opposite opinion makes it difficult to think the other, and even establishes the practice of being skeptical towards it. And yet the true dialectical situation is that anyone who can think the one thought can ipso think the other, indeed has ipso already thought the other, if he has thought the one. I have in mind here the quasi-dogma of eternal punishment. The problem the crumbs presented was, how can something historical be decisive for an eternal happiness? In saying decisive, we are ipso saying that once the happiness is decided, so too is the unhappiness, either as posited or as excluded. The first is assumed to be easy to understand. It is something every systematic philosopher has thought, every believer, and we are all indeed believers. It is a piece of cake acquiring a historical point of departure for one's eternal happiness and having it thought. In the midst of all this safety and reliability, the question comes up occasionally of an eternal unhappiness decided through a historical point of departure. Well now, look, that's a difficult question. It is impossible to make up one's mind what to assume, and one agrees to leave it be, as something to use once in a while in a popular address, but as undecided, alack and alas. And then it has in fact been decided, nothing easier, so long as the first is decided. Amazing human thoughtfulness, who can gaze into your thoughtful eye without being quietly exalted. Here then the result of the continued thoughtfulness. The one thought is understood, the other left in abeyance, i.e., is not understood, and yet this one and that other are, yes, I am almost embarrassed to have to say it, they are one and the same. If time and the relation in time to a historical phenomenon can be decisive for an eternal happiness, then they are ipso for the decision of an eternal unhappiness. Human thoughtfulness proceeds in another way. That is, an eternal happiness is an eternal presupposition from behind, within immanence, for every individual. As eternal, he is higher than time and therefore always has his eternal happiness at his back. That is to say, only an eternal happiness is thinkable, an eternal unhappiness is absolutely unthinkable. This is philosophically entirely in order. Christianity now comes along and posits the disjunction, either an eternal happiness or an eternal unhappiness, and decision in time. What then does human thoughtfulness do? It does not, like the crumbs. Notice that this is a hard saying and the invitation to think it the hardest proposal that can be made. So it does not do what it jays for that. The crumbs might just as well have posed the opposite and let that be the problem. How can something historical become decisive for an eternal unhappiness? In that case human thoughtfulness would no doubt have found it something worth asking about, seeing it could not even be answered. Was first possible to do, it fails even to formulate the problem. No, it tells a little lie and things then go along fairly well. It takes the first half of the disjunction, either an eternal happiness, and understands by it the idea of immanence, which precisely excludes the disjunction, and with that it has solved the whole problem, until declaring bankruptcy when it comes to the second half of the disjunction, admitting that it cannot think it, which is to give itself the lie and denounce itself for having failed to think the first half. The paradoxical character of Christianity lies in its constant use of time and the historical in relation to the eternal. All thinking lies in immanence, and what then does human thoughtfulness do? It thinks immanence, pretends that this is the first half of the disjunction, and then it has thought Christianity is now to Lessing. The passage is found in a little essay, Über den Beweis des Geistes und der Kraft, and den Herrn direct to Schumann. L. opposes what I would call quantifying oneself into a qualitative decision. He contests the direct transition from historical trustworthiness to deciding an eternal happiness. He does not deny, for he is quick to make concessions in the interests of clarity in the categories, that what the scriptures say of miracles and prophecies is just as reliable as other historical reports, yes, as reliable as historical reports can be at all, aber nun, wenn sie nur eben so zuverlässig sind, warum macht man sie bei dem Gebrauch auf einmal unendlich zuverlässiger? Page 79, it is because one wants to base the acceptance of a doctrine that stipulates an eternal happiness on them, that is, wants to base an eternal happiness on them. L. is willing, just like anyone else, to believe that there once lived an Alexander who conquered all Asia, aber wollte auf diesen Glauben hin irgendetwas vom großem und dauerhaftem Belange, dessen Belust nicht zu ersetzen wäre, wagen. Page 81. It is always the transition, the direct transition, from dependable history to an eternal decision that Lessing contests. The position he adopts is therefore one in which a distinction is drawn between reports k. The proofs by which a devout orthodoxy has sought to secure the dogma of eternal punishment must be considered a misunderstanding. Still, its procedure is not at all like that of speculative philosophy, for since the latter really lies in the disjunction, all demonstration is superfluous. Relating to miracles and prophecies, between these and being contemporary with such things. This distinction is one that the Crumbs has noted in providing contemporaneity experimentally and thus eliminating what has been referred to as the subsequent history. From the reports, i.e., from their admitted reliability, nothing follows, says Lessing, but, he adds, that if he had been contemporary with the miracles and the prophecies, that would have helped him. Well informed as Lessing always is, he therefore protests against a partially misleading quotation from Origen 28 that has been cited with the aim of bringing this proof of the truth of Christianity into relief. He protests by adding the closing words of the quotation, which show that though assumes that in his time miracles still occurred, and that he assigns a demonstrative power to these miracles, with which he is contemporary, just as those that he reads about. Since Lessing has taken this position regarding a given account, there is no opportunity for him to underline the further dialectical problem of whether contemporaneity would be a phani help, whether it could be more than occasion, which the historical report can also be. Lessing seems to assume the contrary, but perhaps this appearance is produced so stogitis fencing e concessis 29 a greater degree of dialectical clarity in the face of a definite particularman. The crumbs sought to show that, on the contrary, contemporaneity helps not at all, because there is in all eternity no direct transition, which of course would also have been an immeasurable injustice against all who came after, an injustice and a distinction far worse than the one between Jews and Greeks, circumcised and uncircumcised, that Christianity has cancelled. Misleading, it might seem to lead to the absolute distinction between essential and contingent historical truths, a distinction that, after all, is merely a subdivision. If, in spite of the identity of the higher predicate, historical, the distinction here is made absolute, it might seem to follow that regarding essential historical truths it is possible to make the direct transition. I might of course become heated and say, it is impossible that Lessing should be so inconsistent, ergo, and my temper would no doubt convince many. However, I shall confine myself to a polite, perhaps, which assumes that in the adjective, accidental, Lessing has hidden everything but only said something, so that accidental makes no distinction within historical truths, but applies to the genus itself, historical truths which are accidental as such. If not, we have here the whole misunderstanding that crops up again and again in modern philosophy, letting the eternal become historical as a matter of course, and being able to grasp the necessity of the historical. And everything that becomes historical is contingent, for it is precisely through coming into being, becoming historical, that it has its moments of contingency, for contingency is precisely the one factor in all becoming. In this again lies the incommensurability between a historical truth and an eternal decision. Understood in this way, the transition in which something historical and the relation to it become decisive for an eternal happiness is a metabasis or logenios. Lessing even says, if this is not what it is, then I do not understand what Aristotle has meant by it, page 82, a leap both for the contemporary and for the one who comes later. It is a leap, and this is the word that Lessing has used inside the narrow notion of contingency designated by an illusory distinction between the contemporary and the non-contemporary. The words are as follows: das ist der geistig breit graben, über den ich nicht kommen kann so oft unwünschtlich ich aus den Sprung gesucht habe, page 83. Perhaps that word then concerning this preposterous piece of systematic legerdemain, the reader will perhaps recall what was stressed in Crumbs, that nothing comes into being necessarily, because becoming and necessity contradict each another, and that still less, therefore, does anything become necessary by coming into being, since to be necessary is the one thing that it is impossible to become, because it always presupposes to be. Sprung is simply a stylistic turn of phrase. Perhaps this is why the adjective bright is added, to enhance the metaphor's imaginative appeal. It's as if even the smallest leap didn't make the ditch seem infinitely wide, as if it were not equally challenging for someone unable to leap, regardless of the ditch's width. It's as if the passionate dialectical aversion to leaping didn't make the ditch seem infinitely wide, just as Lady Macbeth's passion made the bloodstain appear so vast that not even the ocean could cleanse it. Possibly, the use of the word ernstlich is also a cunning move by Lessing. Given the metaphor's imagery, the earnestness is amusing, as it doesn't correlate with the leap. It's not the ditch's width, externally, that prevents the leap, but rather the internal, dialectical passion that widens the gap. Being almost able to do something inherently has a comedic aspect, but being close to leaping means nothing, precisely because leaping is a decisive category. To have earnestly desired to leap, well, that's classic Lessing, humorously widening the ditch. However, regarding the leap, there's another, more endearing way to jest. Close your eyes, hoist yourself out of Munchausen, and find yourself on the other side, in the systematic promised land. The expression, the leap, is also associated with Lessing in another context. As rare as it is these days for thinkers to evoke the elegant Greek way of philosophizing by succinctly concentrating on a single, apt statement, Lessing vividly reminds us of the Greeks. His knowledge isn't a jumbled mesh of scholarly and speculative interpretations of every conceivable thought and written word. He doesn't merely string these ideas together with a historical method. Instead, he offers something brief and unique. As many Greek thinkers are known by their catchphrases rather than their names, Lessing has left a lasting word. This last word of Lessing's famously sparked considerable debate. The enthusiastic and noble Aabye, who often expresses a desire for mutual understanding with other thinkers, became the custodian of Lessing's last words. Naturally, being a confidant and ironist like Lessing was challenging. Aabye faced much criticism, undeservedly when unfairly attacked, but deservedly so considering Lessing hadn't requested him as a confessor and especially hadn't asked him to publicize their conversation or place emphasis where it didn't belong. There is something highly poetic in this whole situation. Two such markedly developed individualities as L and J in conversation with each other. Enthusiasm's inexhaustible spokesman as observer and the wily Lessing as catechumen. So J is to investigate how things really are with L what happens. To his horror he discovers that, after all, Lessing is a bottomless Spinozist. The enthusiast ventures the utmost and proposes to him the only way out, assalto mortale. Here I must pause a moment. It may look as though J turns out to be the discoverer of the leap. But it must be noted, first, that J is not clear about where the leap essentially belongs. Compared to Spinoza's objectivity, his salto mortale is more like a subjectivizing act than a transition from the eternal to the historical. Secondly, neither is he dialectically clear about the leap, that it cannot be taught or imparted directly, exactly because it is an act of isolation that, precisely regarding what cannot be thought, leaves it to the individual whether he will decide to accept it in faith and on the strength of the absurd. Jacobi, through eloquence, seeks to aid individuals in making the leap. However, this is contradictory, as all direct persuasion becomes an impediment to truly making the leap. Let's not mistake it with assurances about wanting to make the leap. Suppose Jacobi has made the leap and, with his eloquence, convinces a learner to make it. In that case, the learner establishes a direct relationship with Jacobi and consequently doesn't make the leap himself. This direct connection between two individuals is naturally more straightforward, appeasing one's affections and needs more directly and reliably. It's readily comprehended, negating the need for the infinite's dialectic to remain infinitely committed and infinitely passionate in the infinite's empathy. This secret essentially equates everyone in their relationship with God, transforming the perceived instructor into a learner who self-reflects. All instruction then becomes a divine jest, for, in essence, every human is taught only by God. Regarding Lessing, Jacobi simply desires companionship in making the leap. His eloquence is born out of admiration for Lessing, and that's why having Lessing's agreement is crucial to him. Instantly, we detect a dialectical discrepancy. The eloquent, eternally assured individual feels robust and energetic enough to persuade others of his conviction. In doing so, he reveals his uncertainty and the need for others' agreement in his zealous belief. An enthusiast, incapable of contrasting his fervor with any human form, isn't necessarily stronger but weaker, possessing only the fragile strength of a woman. Jacobi can discipline himself into merely representing the idea through his existence. The restraint of isolation, inherently present in the leap, doesn't hold back Jacobi. He feels compelled to share. He's continually effervescing with an eloquence that at times equates with Shakespeare's, but it still aims to directly aid others or seek solace in having Lessing concur. Moving forward, when Jacobi horrifyingly realizes that Lessing is indeed a Spinozist, he speaks from profound conviction, trying to captivate Lessing. Lessing retorts, appreciating Jacobi's passionate persuasion yet highlighting the leap's individual nature with irony. Jacobi continues with his rhetoric, rightly articulating the leap's essence but slightly misrepresenting its individualistic nature. But is wanting here to make the leap into something objective and the leaping itself into something analogous to, for example, finding the Archimedean point. The good thing about the reply is that he does not want a direct relationship, a direct companionship, in the leap. Then follow Lessing's last words, Aus dazu gehört schon ein Sprung, den ich meinen alten beiden an meinem schweren Kopf nicht mehr zermachen darf. Here Lessing, with the dialectical's aid, is being ironical, while the last turn of phrase has an altogether Socratic coloring, speaking of meat and drink, doctors, pack asses and the like, 44 item of his old legs and his heavy head. In spite of the leap being, as we have frequently remarked, the decision, Jacobi wants as though to make a transition through it. He, the eloquent one, wants to entice Lessing. There's not much to it, he says, it's not so difficult a matter, you just step on this springy spot, and the leap will go by itself. This is a perfect example of the pious treachery of eloquence. It is as though one were to recommend being executed with the guillotine, saying, it's all very easy, you simply lay your head on a board, a string is pulled, the axe falls, and you have been executed. But suppose now that being executed was what one did not want, and similarly with the leap. When one is disinclined to make the leap, so disinclined that this passion makes the ditch infinitely wide, then the most cunningly contrived jumping device will be of no help at all. Lessing sees very clearly that the leap, being decisive, is qualitatively dialectical and that it allows no approximating transition. His answer is therefore a joke. It is very far from being dogmatic. It is dialectically entirely correct, is personally evasive, and instead of inventing mediation in a hurry he makes use of his old legs and his heavy head. And of course, for anyone with young legs and a light head, they can safely leap. The psychological juxtaposition between Lessing and Jacobi, when rendered succinctly, can be framed inter alia. Lessing, ip shame nihil serid unum sciat, remains anchored within his own consciousness, devoid of the thirst for companionship. Thus, he deflects with an ironic finesse and distances himself from Jacobi, relying on his seasoned limbs, manifestly not suited for any formidable leap. He remains steadfast in not striving to convince Jacobi of the absence of such a leap. Contrariwise, Jacobi, albeit his palpable zeal for the external, is unmistakably in che quaere. His very longing is epitomized in his fervent endeavors to persuade Lessing. The vehemence of his approach, the impetus with which he thrusts himself upon Lessing, elucidates the depth of his need to engage in a dance with prepositions, a dance Jacobi found irresistibly captivating. The exchanges between Jacobi and Mendelssohn, mediante Emily Reimers, regarding Jacobi's dynamics with Lessing, shed light upon how boundless Lessing was in jesting with a dialectical approach and in Hellenic ebullience with Jacobi, despite holding him in profound regard. Thus, Jacobi recounts that Lessing, cum reino salus, once quipped, he himself might perchance be the supreme being, currently ensnared in the extreme state of contraction. Such statements inevitably led to allegations of Lessing's pantheism. However, the jest's transparency, which doesn't necessarily strip it of deeper implications, shines most luminously in a subsequent anecdote. Upon dining at Gleims, and the onset of rain thwarting their post-dinner-garden plans, Lessing, presumably with a tint of jest, remarked to Jacobi, "Forsit tu simile censures, Jacobi." Moreover, Mendelssohn, not a stranger to these dialogues, astutely signaled the zenith of thought as the leap. This leap, in its endeavor to transcend its confines, yearns for the paradoxical, a sentiment which is a harmonious blend of jest and gravity. Herein lie the core Christian tenets. Beyond this threshold, every dogmatic assertion is a philosophema that has found residence within the human psyche and demands an imminent reflection. The zenith of human thought strives for this paradoxical transcendence. Dialectica in Mysterio, this conundrum isn't effortlessly unraveled. In the Crumbs, I'd endeavored to trace its genesis, revisiting the enigma of Socrates' self-awareness, stumbling over whether he was a mere mortal or a creature more multifaceted than Typhon. Ut sine dubio, my references are exclusively to the realm of thought as experienced by the subjective, existential thinker. The German enigma has always eluded my grasp, how one could metamorphose into speculation, objective speculation, or pure being. One might assume myriad roles in this vast cosmos, as the German adage elucidates: Edelman, Bettelmann, Doctor, Pastor, Schuster, Schneider. This German philosophy I grasp. One can indeed morph into a thinker or a simpleton. However, the evolution into speculation represents the zenith of incredulity. Christianity epitomizes the paradoxical. Mendelssohn posits, to doubt if there exists something which not only surpasses all comprehension, but is utterly beyond comprehension. I term this a leap beyond oneself. Mendelssohn, sine dubio, neither embraces this nor discerns the duality of jest and gravitas therein. This is about all that can be said on Lessing's relation to the leap. It is not much in itself, and it is not entirely clear dialectically what he wanted to make of it. Indeed, it is not even clear whether the note of pathos in that passage from his own writings is a matter of style, and in the conversation with Jay a Socratic joke, or whether these two opposites proceed from and are born by one and the same categorical thought of the leap. The little that is to be found in Lessing has been important for me. I had read Fear and Trembling by Johannes de Silentio before coming to read the volume by Lessing. In that work I learned how in the author's view it was precisely the leap, as the decision Carti exo Chen 54 that became decisive for what is Christian and for every dogmatic category, something that is beyond the reach both of the intellectual intuition of Schelling and of what Hegel, scorning Schelling's idea, would put in its place, namely the method, because the leap is precisely the most decisive protest against the method's inverse course. All Christianity is rooted according to fear and trembling. Yes, rooted in fear and trembling, exactly the desperate categories of Christianity in the leap. In the paradox, whether one accepts this, i.e., is a believer, or rejects it, just because it is the paradox. Although subsequent reading of Lessing made the matter no clearer, since what L says is so very little, to me it was nevertheless always encouraging to see that L was aware of it. Just a pity that he did not care to pursue this thought. But then neither did he have mediation on his hands, the divine and idealized mediation that works and has worked miracles and turned a human being into speculation, and cast a spell over Christianity. All honor to mediation. No doubt it can help one in another way too, as it presumably helped the author of Fear and Trembling to seek the desperate expedience of the leap, just as Christianity too was ASCF. Jacobi, Works, 4th volume, 1st sec, page 110. Desperate expedient when it entered the world and, in all ages, remains so for everyone who really accepts it. A fiery and spirited steed may very well come to lose its wind and proud-bearing when held for hire and ridden by every dabbler, but in the world of the spirit, sloth is never victorious. It loses constantly and remains outside. As to whether Johannes de Silentio learned of the leap by reading Lessing remains undecided. 4. Lessing has said, "Wenn dort insane rectinal Wahrheit, und insane Linken den einzigen immer regen trieb nach Wahrheit, obskon mit dem Zusatze mich immer an Vuig zu irren, verschlossen Helter, und sprech zu mir, Warner. Ik fehle IHMMIT demuth in sen Linker, unsagti, Veta, Gib. Die rein Wahrheit ist ja doch nur für dich allen." Cf. Lessing's SW, 5 B, Page 0.100. Presumably, by the time Lessing said this, the system was not ready. Alas, and now he is dead. If he were alive now, when the system is just about done, or is in hand and will be finished on Sunday, believe me, L would have grabbed after it with both hands. He would have had neither the time nor the manners, nor the elation, thus in gestures they'll play odds and evens with God and choose in earnest the left hand. But then the system has more to offer than God has in both hands. It has more even this very moment, to say nothing of next Sunday when it will quite certainly be finished. The words are found in a little essay, I in a duplicate, 1778, occasioned by a devout man's defense of the story of the resurrection against the attack made upon it in the fragments published by Lessing. It is no doubt common knowledge that people simply failed to see the point of L's publishing these fragments. Not even the good and widely read Haupt Pastor Goethe could make up his mind what passage in the Apocalypse 58 applied to it and indeed was fulfilled in Lessing. People in their relation to him have been to that extent forced in a curious way to accept his principle. Although in those days too there were results and finalities to spare, it was quite impossible to have Lessing killed and world historically butchered and salted in a section. He was and remained a riddle. If anyone should try calling him back now, he will get no further with him. Here, first, an assurance regarding my own humble person. I am as willing as the next man to fall down in worship before the system, if only I can get a glimpse of it. Up to now I have not managed, and although I have young legs I am practically worn out with running from Herod to Pilate. Once or twice I have been on the brink of adoration, but lo and behold, with my handkerchief already spread on the ground to avoid dirtying my trousers from kneeling, and just as I had in all innocence made a final appeal to one of the initiates, tell me honestly now, is it quite finished? Because if so I will fling myself down, even at the risk of ruining a pair of trousers, for due to the heavy traffic to and from the system, the road has become not a little muddy. I always got the answer, no, it is still not quite ready. And so there was once more a postponement of the system and the kneeling. System and closure are pretty much one and the same, so that if the system is not completed there is no system. I have already pointed out in another place that a system which is not quite completed is a hypothesis, while a half-finished system is nonsense. Were someone now to say that this is just a dispute about words, and that the systematicians themselves say that the system is not finished, I would simply ask, why then do they call it a system? Why at all do they speak with forked tongues? When they deliver their compendia, they say nothing about there being anything missing. Thus they lead the less knowledgeable to suppose that everything is complete, unless they are writing for those better informed than themselves, which would no doubt strike the systematizers as unthinkable. If, on the other hand, the building is tampered with, out comes the builder. He is an extremely pleasant man, courteous and friendly to the visitor. He says, yes, we are still under construction, the system is still not quite finished. But did he not know that beforehand? Did he not know it when he had his beatifying invitation sent out to all mankind? If he did know, why did he not say so himself, i.e., why did he not refrain from calling the fragment on offer a system? For here we have it again, a fragment of a system is nonsense. A continued striving for a system, on the other hand, is still a striving, and a striving, indeed a continued striving, is exactly what Lessing is talking about. And surely not a striving for nothing. On the contrary, Lessing speaks of a striving for truth, and he uses a remarkable phrase about this urge to truth, den einzigen immeregen Trieb. This word, einzig, 61, can hardly be understood otherwise than as equivalent to the infinite in the same sense as that having one thought, just one, is higher than having many. So these two, Lessing and the systematizer, both talk of a continued striving, except that Lessing is stupid or honest enough to call it a continued striving, while the systematizer is clever or dishonest enough to call it the system. How would this difference be judged in other contexts? When commission agent Behrend had lost a silk umbrella, he advertised for it as a cotton one, thinking, if I say it is a silk umbrella, the finder will be more easily tempted to keep it. Perhaps the systematizer thinks as follows. If on the title page and in the newspaper, I call my offering a continued striving for the truth, alas, who will buy it or admire me? But if I call it the system, the absolute system, everyone will buy the system, if only there are not the remaining difficulty that what the systematizer sells is not the system. So let us proceed, but let us not play games with each another. I, Johannes Climacus, am neither more nor less than a human being, and I assume that the person I have the honor of conversing with is also a human being. If he wants to be speculation, pure speculative thought, I must stop conversing with him, for at that moment he vanishes from my sight and from the feeble mortal eye of a human being. Consequently, there can be a logical system, B, but there can be no system for life itself. Chapter: The Dichotomy of Certainty and Venture. Since I have refrained from proving the existence of an eternal happiness, partly because this task aligns more with Christianity, which proclaims it, and partly because its existence cannot be demonstrated in an empirical sense, but only through the individual who, in his existence, attests for its presence, I shall take a moment to scrutinize the words of that serious man. They are, undoubtedly, worthy of contemplation. He desires certainty and clarity about the prospect of such a good awaiting him. However, it seems an onerous request to expect something awaiting in the future to be certain and clear-cut. The mere fragment of time that separates the present from the future allows for the anticipation of the future but denies its present-day certainty and clarity. It is the realm of the present that harbors certainty and definition. A present relation to a future prospect inherently dwells in uncertainty, and thus aptly pertains to expectation. From a speculative vantage point, it concerns my ability to connect with the eternal retrospectively through recollection, or the eternal being's direct relation to the eternal. However, for someone in existence, the relation to the eternal looking forward manifests as a future prospect. The serious man continues, if he can secure certainty regarding such a good in waiting, he will wager all on it, failing which, he deems it insanity. His tone mimics that of a jest. It's evident he aims to bemuse us, reminiscent of the farmer who prepares to dive but hesitates at the leap. Upon proof, he will risk it all. Yet, what does it mean to take a risk? The essence of risk is uncertainty. With certainty established, the risk dissolves. If he attains the sought-after certainty and clarity, he cannot genuinely risk it all, for even if he sacrifices everything, he risks naught. Conversely, if certainty eludes him, our grave man states, with staunch seriousness, that he would then not risk it all, for it would border on lunacy. His proclaimed venture hence is but a hollow threat. When what I hope to gain by risking is inherently certain, it isn't a gamble but a trade. This logic is not lost on the cunning. They want tangible assurance of what they're trading for. Offering all I possess for a pearl isn't a gamble if the pearl is already in my grasp during the trade. Yet, if the pearl lies in a distant land, obscured and elusive, and I abandon everything for this uncertain quest, then I truly venture, a madness in the eyes of many. However surreal the challenges faced by such an adventurer, nothing compares to the surrealism of the serious man's pronouncement. For in all his earnestness, the sole truthful words that endure, it is, indeed, madness. Venturing is always a leap into the unknown, but risking all for the anticipation of eternal happiness is the pinnacle of madness. Seeking certainty is prudence, an attempt to sidestep the rigor of action and gamble, and instead to shift the issue to the domains of knowledge and discourse. True venturing requires uncertainty and a space vast enough to move. The most expansive room I can move in is not one bound by the confines of empirical knowledge or the tangible realm. It is a space carved out by the sheer magnitude of uncertainty, by the vast expanse of the unknown, where faith and belief are the only guiding stars. For what is life, if not a series of ventures into the uncertain? Every choice we make, every path we choose to walk, is riddled with the unknown. To demand certainty in every endeavor is not only an exercise in futility but also a limitation we place upon ourselves. It restricts our experiences, confines our potential, and diminishes the essence of existence. I shall with pleasure illumine the same with an over-example. The lover, in the period of courtship, may risk all for his love, for the possession of the beloved, but the married man, who is already in possession of the beloved, risks nothing for her, even if he carries all burdens with her, does everything for her sake, so that for him to use the expression that is the mark of the lover's most sublime infatuation would be to insult his wife. The married man has possession of the beloved, and if the eternal happiness could be similarly present to a person, then he would not be venturing either. But the misfortune is that it cannot itself be present in just that way, even for someone existing who has ventured everything. As long as he is existing, and that little envy once more, he must have risked everything, since he received no certainty beforehand from an asseverating philosopher or a surety providing priest. For strangely enough, although the eternal happiness is the highest good, far greater than landed properties and kingdoms, what makes it absolutely the good is that the one who gives it away asks no questions at all about the other's surety, and the one who is to receive it would not be helped one bit if even everyone were his guarantor, but the matter is decided simply and solely between the one who gives it away and the respective recipient. Almost as great a madness, I was about to say, on the part of the giver, in not having a better regard to his own security and advantage, as on that of the recipient, that he should not become suspicious and smell a rat when he stands there alone when all guarantors have disappeared from view. True, all worldly wisdom is abstraction, and only the most mediocre eudaimonism has no abstraction whatever and is only enjoyment of the moment. A eudaimonistic philosophy of life is prudent to the degree that there is some abstraction in it. The more prudence, the more abstraction. This gives eudaimonism a fleeting resemblance to the ethical and the ethico-religious, and it can seem for a moment as if they could proceed in a pair. Yet it is not so, for the first step taken by the ethical is that of infinite abstraction, and what then? That step is too long for eudaimonism, and although some abstraction is prudence, eudaimonistical and infinite abstraction is madness. Perhaps a philosopher will want to say here that I am moving only within the sphere of ideas. Yes, it is true that it is easier to put things together on paper, where one stakes everything and in the same instant has everything. But if in existence I am to risk everything, and if, with my risky venture, I am to stay in existence, then I must keep on venturing constantly. The esteemed philosopher, as usual, moves the stage from existence to paper. In Where There Is Room Enough for the Most Intense Gesture of the Passion of the Infinite is uncertainty of knowledge regarding an eternal happiness, or the fact that the choice is in a finite sense madness. Now there is room, now you can venture. And that is why the eternal happiness as the absolute good has the remarkable trait that it can be defined solely by the mode of acquisition, whereas other goods, precisely because the mode of acquisition is accidental, or at any rate relatively dialectical, must be defined by the good itself. Money, for example, can both be acquired and had without acquisition, and these latter can in turn each differ in many ways, but money still remains the same good. And knowledge, for instance, is also variously obtainable according to talent and external circumstances, and therefore cannot be defined solely by the mode of acquisition. With concerning the eternal happiness nothing can be said except that it is the good which is to be attained by risking everything. Every description of the glory of this good is already as though an attempt to make several modes of acquisition possible, one easier, for example, and one more difficult, which proves that the description is not of the absolute good, but only fancies itself to be that, while referring essentially to relative goods. And this is why in a certain sense it is so easy to talk about this good, and why the speaker will never find himself in a fix, as when it becomes clear in the case of relative goods that what helps one person does not help another. And this is why talk of this good is so brief, for there is no more to say than risk everything. No anecdotes to tell about how Peter became rich by hard work, and Paul by playing the lottery, and Hans by inheritance, and Mads by the change in the value of the currency, and Christopher by purchasing a piece of furniture from a second-hand dealer, etc. But in another sense the talk may be very long, the longest talk of all, because risking everything requires a transparency of consciousness that is acquired only very slowly. It is here that the religious talk has its task. Were it supposed merely to utter the brief words, risk everything, there would be no need in all the realm for more than one speaker. On the other hand, the longest address must never forget the risky venture. The religious address may embrace everything, so long as it constantly brings it all to bear on the absolute category of religiousness. It must follow every path, know where the errors are housed, where the moods have their hiding places, know how the passions understand themselves in solitude, and every man who has passion is always to some extent solitary. Only the drivellers are wholly swallowed up in social life. Know where the illusions tempt, where the paths swing off, etc., in order constantly to bring everything to bear on the absolute category of religiousness. If one human being can do something in this respect for another, then he is not to go to the trouble of passing on to China and Persia, because his religious discourse is higher than all other discourse. So all truly religious discourse knows nothing on the other side of the absolute good, an eternal happiness, for it knows that the task is not from the individual to the race, but from the individual through the race, the universal, to reach the individual. The religious address is the way over to the good, that is to say, it simulates them the path, which is as long as life. It simulates the path that the religious person describes, not in the sense in which the planet describes its path or the mathematician describes a circle. But there is no short cut to the absolute good, and since it can be described only by the mode of acquisition, the only mark by which one's relation to the absolute good can be known is the absolute difficulty of the latter. To stumble on it in an easier way, as by being born under especially favorable circumstances, for instance, in the 19th century, by being intelligent, by being born in the same town as a great man, or related by marriage to an apostle, to be a favorite of fortune, is merely evidence that one is being made a fool of, because Mrs. Fortune's favorites do not belong in the religious sphere. The merit of the religious discourse is to make the way difficult, for it is the way that is decisive, otherwise we have aesthetics. But Christianity has made that way as difficult as possible, and it is only an illusion, which has blinded many, that Christianity has made the way easy, since the only help it has given people is precisely through the beginning becoming far harder than it ever was. If a pagan has caught a glimpse of the absolute good, Christianity has helped, with the absurd. If this is left out, everything indeed has become much easier than in paganism, but if it is kept hold of, then everything is far more difficult, for it is easier to cling to a weak hope through one's own powers than to acquire certainty on the strength of the absurd. When an aesthetic sufferer bemoans his fate and seeks solace in M, we see here again why the religious speaker must not use the foreshortened perspective. Aesthetically there is no path, because the aesthetic bears on immediacy and the foreshortened perspective expresses this. Ethically and ethico-religiously, however, it is precisely the path that is reflected upon, and what is true aesthetically is therefore ethically and ethico-religiously a deception. The ethical really has the solace, and at first it makes the aesthetic sufferer an even greater sufferer than he was before. If this consideration is left out, the ethical makes everything comfortable and easy, but then one is also taking the ethical in vain. However much an aesthetic sufferer bemoans his fate, he may very well come to suffer still more, and when he then sends for the ethical, well, first it helps him out of the frying pan into the fire, so that he really has something to scream about, and only then does it help. So too with Christianity, it requires that the individual, in existing, risk everything, the pathetic aspect. This is something a pagan can also do, stake everything, for example, on immortalities, if. But Christianity requires that the individual also stake his thought, venturing to believe against the understanding, the dialectical aspect. And while that serious man never got as far as risking anything because he demanded certainty, then there is one certainty is certain, namely that this is the absolute risky venture. Struggling through life on the basis of immortality may seem strenuous enough, and obtaining proof of the resurrection a huge relief, were it not for the fact that the proof is the greatest difficulty of all. To get everything with the help of an intermediary seems easy enough, compared with paganism, where the greatest exertion of the wise brought him but little gain. But now suppose that the most difficult thing of all is the very existence of an intermediary. To get everything with the help of a gospel does seem easy enough, if only there being a gospel were not the greatest difficulty. To be capable of everything through God is easy enough, if only not being capable of anything at all were not the most difficult thing of all, so difficult that in any generation there are probably few who can truthfully say that they are, day in and day out, even moderately aware that a human being is capable of nothing at all. But if you skip the dialectical, what happens? Why, the whole affair then becomes women's prattle and female wailing, for as all know, Jews and women wail in a single minute what a man cannot get through in a lifetime. If you skip over the dialectical, then the proof of the resurrection becomes, ironically enough, too convincing and the certainty of immortality less than in paganism. The intermediary then becomes an ambiguous character, an aesthetically showy person with a halo and a wishing cap. The gospel becomes rumor, a piece of town gossip. Then the person able to do all things with God, who can do a little by himself and is polite enough to pretend it was through God, comes far behind the person who, in existing, even moderately practices the strenuous consciousness that he is capable of nothing. If we skip over the dialectical, all of Christianity becomes a facile make-believe, it becomes nothing but a superstition, yes, the most dangerous of superstitions, because it is superstitious belief in the truth, if indeed Christianity is the truth. Superstitious belief in untruth leaves open the possibility that truth may come and awaken it, but when the truth is, and the superstitious mode of apprehending it transforms it into a lie, no deliverance is possible. No, the likeness of Christianity has only one distinguishing feature, the difficulty. It is in this way that its yoke is easy and its burden light, for him who has cast off everything, yes, all his burdens, those of hope, of fear, of despondency, and of despair, but that is very difficult. And the difficulty is again the absolute difficulty, not the comparative dialectical one, easier for the one human being than for the other, because the difficulty relates to each individual separately and demands his absolute effort absolutely. For just as the religious sphere has no favorites of fortune or any lottery distributions, so too are there no wronged individualities. And how does the God's existence emerge from the proof? Does it follow straightway, without any breach of continuity? Or have we not here an analogy to the behavior of the little Cartesian dolls? As soon as I let go of the doll, it stands on its head. As soon as I let it go, I must therefore let it go. So also with the proof. As long as I keep my hold on the proof, i.e., continue to demonstrate, the existence does not come out, if for no other reason than that I am engaged in proving it. But when I let the proof go, the existence is there. But this act of letting go is surely also something. It is indeed a contribution of mine. Must not this also be taken into the account? This little moment, brief as it may be, it need not be long, for it is a leap. However brief this moment, if only an instantaneous now, this now must be included in the reckoning. If anyone wishes to have it ignored, I will use it to tell a little anecdote, in order to show that it nevertheless does exist. Chrysippus was experimenting with a sorties to see if he could not bring about a break in its quality, either progressively or retrogressively. But Carnate could not get it in his head when the new quality actually emerged. Then Chrysippus told him to try making a little pause in the reckoning, and so it would be easier to understand. Carnate replied, with the greatest pleasure, please do not hesitate on my account. You may not only pause, but even lie down to sleep, and it will help you just as little, for when you awake we will begin again where you left off. Just so, it boots as little to try to get rid of something by sleeping as to try to come into the possession of something in the same manner. Whoever therefore attempts to demonstrate the existence of God, except in the sense of clarifying the concept, and without the reservatio finalis noted above, that the existence emerges from the demonstration by a leap, proves in you there is something else, something which at times perhaps does not need a proof, and in any case needs none better. For the fool says in his heart that there is no God, but whoever says in his heart or to men, wait just a little and I will prove it, what a rare man of wisdom is he. Free if in the moment of beginning his proof it is not absolutely undetermined whether the God exists or not, he does not prove it, and if it is thus undetermined in the beginning he will never come to begin, partly from fear of failure, since the God perhaps does not exist, and partly because he has nothing with which to begin. A project of this kind would scarcely have been undertaken by the ancients. Socrates at least, who is credited with having put forth the physico-teleological proof for God's existence, did not go about it in any such manner. He always presupposes the God's existence, and under this presupposition seeks to interpenetrate nature with the idea of purpose. Had he been asked why he pursued this method, he would doubtless have explained that he lacked the courage to venture out upon so perilous a voyage of discovery without having made sure of the God's existence behind him. At the word of the God he casts his net as if to catch the idea of purpose, for nature herself finds many means of frightening the inquirer, and distracts him by many a digression. The paradoxical passion of the reason thus comes repeatedly into collision with this unknown, which does indeed exist, but is unknown, and in so far does not exist. The reason cannot advance beyond this point, and yet it cannot refrain in its paradoxicalness from arriving at this limit and occupying itself therewith. It will not serve to dismiss its relation to it simply by asserting that the unknown does not exist, since this itself involves a relationship. But what then is the unknown, since the designation of it as the God merely signifies for us that it is unknown? To say that it is the unknown because it cannot be known, and even if it were capable of being known, it could not be expressed, does not satisfy the demands of passion, though it correctly interprets the unknown as a limit. But a limit is precisely a torment for passion, though it also serves as an incitement. And yet the reason can come no further, whether it risks an issue via negationize or via eminentia. What then is the unknown? It is the limit to which the reason repeatedly comes, and in so far, substituting a static form of conception for the dynamic, it is the different, the absolutely different. But because it is absolutely different, there is no mark by which it could be distinguished. When qualified as absolutely different, it seems on the verge of disclosure, but this is not the case, for the reason cannot even conceive an absolute unlikeness. The reason cannot negate itself absolutely, but uses itself for the purpose, and thus conceives only such an unlikeness within itself as it can conceive by means of itself. It cannot absolutely transcend itself, and hence conceives only such a superiority over itself as it can conceive by means of itself. Unless the unknown, the God, remains a mere limiting conception, the single idea of difference will be thrown into a state of confusion, and become many ideas of many differences. The unknown is then in a condition of dispersion, and the reason may choose a pleasure from what is at hand, and the imagination may suggest the monstrous, the ludicrous, etc. But it is impossible to hold fast to a difference of this nature. Every time this is done, it is essentially an arbitrary act, and deepest down in the heart of piety lurks the mad caprice which knows that it has itself produced the God. If no specific determination of difference can be held fast, because there is no distinguishing mark, like and unlike finally become identified with one another, thus sharing the fate of all such dialectical opposites. The unlikeness clings to the reason and confounds it, so that the reason no longer knows itself and quite consistently confuses itself with the unlikeness. On this point, paganism has been sufficiently prolific in fantastic inventions. As for the last named supposition, the self-irony of the reason, I shall attempt to delineate it merely by a stroke or two, without raising any question of its being historical. There exists an individual whose appearance is precisely like that of other men. He grows up to manhood like others, he marries, he has an occupation by which he earns his livelihood, and he makes provision for the future as befits a man. For though it may be beautiful to live like the birds of the air, it is not lawful, and may lead to the sorriest of consequences, either starvation if one has enough persistence, or dependence on the bounty of others. This man is also the God. How do I know? I cannot know it, for in order to know it I would have to know the God, and the nature of the difference between the God and man. And this I cannot know, because the reason has reduced it to likeness with that from which it was unlike. Thus the God becomes the most terrible of deceivers, because the reason has deceived itself. The reason has brought the God as near as possible, and yet he is as far away as ever. Now perhaps someone will say, you are certainly a crotcheteer, as I know very well. But you surely do not believe that I would pay any attention to such a crotchet, so strange or so ridiculous that it has doubtless never occurred to anyone, and above all so absurd that I must exclude from my consciousness everything that I have in it in order to hit upon it. And so indeed you must. But do you think yourself warranted in retaining all the presuppositions you had in your consciousness, while pretending to think about your consciousness without presuppositions? Will you deny the consistency of our exposition, that the reason, in attempting to determine the unknown as the unlike, at last goes astray, and confounds the unlike with the like? From this there would seem to follow the further consequence, that if man is to receive any true knowledge about the unknown, the God, he must be made to know that it is unlike him, absolutely unlike him. This knowledge the reason cannot possibly obtain of itself. We have already seen that this would be a self-contradiction. It will therefore have to obtain this knowledge from the God. But even if it obtains such knowledge, it cannot understand it, and thus is quite unable to possess its knowledge. For how should the reason be able to understand what is absolutely different from itself? If this is not immediately evident, it will become clearer in the light of the consequences. For if the God is absolutely unlike man, then man is absolutely unlike the God. But how could the reason be expected to understand this? Here we seem to be confronted with a paradox. Merely to obtain the knowledge that the God is unlike him, man needs the help of the God, and now he learns that the God is absolutely different from himself. But if the God and man are absolutely different, this cannot be accounted for on the basis of what man derives from the God, for insofar they are akin. Their unlikeness must therefore be explained by what man derives from himself, or by what he has brought upon his own head. But what can this unlikeness be? Aye, what can it be but sin? Since the unlikeness, the absolute unlikeness, is something that man has brought upon himself. We have expressed this in the preceding by saying that man was in error, and had brought this upon his head by his own guilt. and we came to the conclusion, partly in jest and yet also in earnest, that it was too much to expect of man that he should find this out for himself. Now we have again arrived at the same conclusion. The connoisseur in self-knowledge was perplexed over himself to the point of bewilderment when he came to grapple in thought with the unlike. He scarcely knew any longer whether he was a stranger monster than Typhon, or if his nature partook of something divine. What then did he lack? The consciousness of sin, which he indeed could no more teach to another than another could teach it to him, but only the God, if the God consents to become a teacher. But this was his purpose, as we have imagined it. In order to be man's teacher, the God proposed to make himself like the individual man, so that he might understand him fully. Thus our paradox is rendered still more appalling, for the same paradox has the double aspect which proclaims it as the absolute paradox, negatively by revealing the absolute unlikeness of sin, positively by proposing to do away with the absolute unlikeness in absolute likeness. But can such a paradox be conceived? Let us not be over hasty in replying, and since we strive merely to find the answer to a question, and not as those who run a race, it may be well to remember that success is to the accurate rather than to the swift. The reason will doubtless find it impossible to conceive it, could not of itself have discovered it, and when it hears it announced will not be able to understand it, sensing merely that its downfall is threatened. In so far the reason will have much to urge against it, and yet we have on the other hand seen that the reason, in its paradoxical passion, precisely desires its own downfall. But this is what the paradox also desires, and thus they are at bottom linked in understanding, but this understanding is present only in the moment of passion. Consider the analogy presented by love, though it is not a perfect one. Self-love lies as the ground of love, but the paradoxical passion of self-love when at its highest pitch wills precisely its own downfall. This is also what love desires, so that these two are linked in mutual understanding in the passion of the moment, and this passion is love. Why should not the lover find this conceivable? But he who in self-love shrinks from the touch of love can neither understand it nor summon the courage to venture it, since it means his downfall. Such is then the passion of love. Self-love is indeed submerged, but not annihilated. It is taken captive and become love's folio opima, but may again come to life, and this is love's temptation. So also with the paradox in its relation to the reason, only that the passion in this case has another name, or rather, we must seek to find a name for it. A. Freedom lost bestially. This is perhaps the most horrifying and evident. When a person loses freedom in a beastly manner, they stoop below beasts since humans were intended to rise above them. Life showcases many instances of this demonic form. Ethical observation notes how sin consistently emerges from this form, while psychological observation examines the state. The essence of this state is anxiety about the good. For instance, the demoniac in the New Testament tells Christ upon his approach, "What have I to do with you?" Another asks Christ to leave. Similarly, a drunkard might say, "Let me be the filth I am." This might explain why some united due to unnatural excesses. The anxiety is so intense that they can only counteract it through mutual support. This type of loss can destroy the body, which then becomes a subject for medical treatment. Medicine can help, but it might also pave the way for new sins. B. Freedom lost intellectually. In essence, freedom's content is truth, and truth liberates. John chapter 8 verse 32. Conversely, truth is freedom's product, always emerging. If someone doesn't recognize the result of this truth or doesn't convert truth's actuality into a possibility for themselves, it can naturally reduce anxiety. Modern science often showcases this demonic form. Someone may develop the truth but remain indifferent to its certainty. They might provide proof of the soul's immortality using a combination of all existing proofs but shy away from the truth of immortality. They might fool themselves and others by emphasizing the proof's importance, neglecting the concept of immortality. They might invest their entire soul in proving a point, and upon proving it, feel absolved of all else. Chapter: The Enigma of Existence. In our quest for understanding, let's commence with a bold assertion. Let's presume we comprehend the essence of man. This assumption is the very cornerstone of truth that Greek philosophy either pursued, doubted, postulated, or applied. Isn't it intriguing how the Greeks bequeathed this testament to us? The very essence of Greek culture might be encapsulated in this assertion, a concise reflection more illuminating than verbose philosophical treatises. Such a proposition, thus, is invaluable. It's been expounded upon in previous chapters, and those who interpret Socrates otherwise must tread cautiously, lest they get ensnared in either early or later Greek skepticism. Without firmly grasping the Socratic doctrine of recollection, which posits that every individual embodies humanity itself, we risk succumbing to the arguments of Sextus Empiricus and Protagoras. The latter may argue that each person determines reality for others, deviating from Socrates' belief that every person is their own measure. So, we believe we grasp the essence of man, but wisdom of profound value that may continuously deepen. Yet, at this juncture, reason halts, mirroring Socrates' own pause. The paradoxical passion of reason is incited, seeking a clash. In its confusion, it desires its own defeat, analogous to the conundrum of love. Man lives harmoniously, centered within himself, until the paradox of self-love awakens in the guise of love for another. The lover, transformed by this paradox, barely recognizes himself, echoing sentiments of poets who narrate tales of such passions. Similarly, the paradoxical passion of reason, even as a mere inkling, retroactively alters one's self-perception, leaving them questioning their very essence. What is this enigmatic entity with which reason grapples, resulting in the upheaval of one's self-understanding? It is the unknown, distinct from humans as we understand them and divergent from any known entity. We designate this unknown as the God, a mere label. The notion of proving the existence of this God is inherently fraught. If God doesn't exist, proof is unattainable. If he does, attempting such proof is redundant. Attempting to elucidate the God's existence often devolves into an exercise in semantics. Typically, it's arduous to prove the existence of anything. Proofs invariably veer towards the consequences of presupposing existence rather than establishing it. Demonstrations usually emphasize the characteristics of a known existence rather than its actuality. Existence, whether viewed as an accessory or an eternal foundation, eludes definitive proof. We ought to deliberate thoroughly. There's no rush, unlike those who, for personal or divine reasons, are desperate to establish existence. The process of proving is treacherous, especially when there's an underlying assumption that existence is a given, regardless of the outcome of the proof. If it were proposed to prove Napoleon's existence from Napoleon's deeds, would it not be a most curious proceeding? His existence does indeed explain his deeds, but the deeds do not prove his existence, unless I have already understood the work his, so as thereby to have assumed his existence. But Napoleon is only an individual, and in so far there exists no absolute relationship between him and his deeds. Some other person might have performed the same deeds. Perhaps this is the reason why I cannot pass from the deeds to existence. If I call these deeds the deeds of Napoleon, the proof becomes superfluous, since I have already named him. If I ignore this, I can never prove from the deeds that they are Napoleon's, but only in a purely ideal manner that such deeds are the deeds of a great general, and so forth. But between the God and his works there is an absolute relationship. God is not a name but a concept. Is this perhaps the reason that his assentia involveth existentium? To the works of God are such that only the God can perform them. Just so, but where then are the works of the God? The works from which I would deduce his existence are not directly and immediately given. The wisdom in nature, the goodness, the wisdom in the governance of the world, are all these manifest, perhaps, upon the very face of things. Are we not here confronted with the most terrible temptations to doubt, and is it not impossible finally to dispose of all these doubts? But from such an order of things I will surely not attempt to prove God's existence, and even if I began, I would never finish, and would in addition have to live constantly in suspense, lest something so terrible should suddenly happen that my bit of proof would be demolished. From what works then do I propose to derive the proof? From the works as apprehended through an ideal interpretation, i.e., such as they do not immediately reveal themselves. But in that case, it is not from the works that I make the proof. I merely develop the ideality I have presupposed, and because of my confidence in this I make so bold as to defy all objections, even those that have not yet been made. In beginning my proof I presuppose the ideal interpretation, and also that I will be successful in carrying it through. But what else is this but to presuppose that the God exists, so that I really begin by virtue of confidence in him? And how does the God's existence emerge from the proof? Does it follow straightway, without any breach of continuity? Or have we not here an analogy to the behavior of the little Cartesian dolls? As soon as I let go of the doll it stands on its head. As soon as I let it go, I must therefore let it go. So also with the proof. As long as I keep my hold on the proof, i.e., continue to demonstrate, the existence does not come out, if for no other reason than that I am engaged in proving it. But when I let the proof go, the existence is there. But this act of letting go is surely also something. It is indeed a contribution of mine. Must not this also be taken into the account? This little moment, brief as it may be, it need not be long, for it is a leap. However, brief this moment, if only an instantaneous now, this now must be included in the reckoning. If anyone wishes to have it ignored, I will use it to tell a little anecdote, in order to show that it nevertheless does exist. Chrysippus was experimenting with a sortie to see if he could not bring about a break in its quality, either progressively or retrogressively. But Carnates could not get it in his head when the new quality actually emerged. Then Chrysippus told him to try making a little pause in the reckoning, and so it would be easier to understand. Carnates replied, "With the greatest pleasure, please do not hesitate on my account. You may not only pause, but even lie down to sleep, and it will help you just as little, for when you awake, we will begin again where you left off." Just so, it boots as little to try to get rid of something by sleeping as to try to come into the possession of something in the same manner. Whoever therefore attempts to demonstrate the existence of God, except in the sense of clarifying the concept, and without the reservation finalist noted above, that the existence emerges from the demonstration by a leap, proves anew there is something else, something which at times perhaps does not need a proof, and in any case needs none better. For the fool says in his heart that there is no God, but whoever says in his heart or to men, "Wait just a little and I will prove it," what a rare man of wisdom is he. 3. If in the moment of beginning his proof it is not absolutely undetermined whether the God exists or not, he does not prove it, and if it is thus undetermined in the beginning, he will never come to begin, partly from fear of failure, since the God perhaps does not exist, and partly because he has nothing with which to begin. A project of this kind would scarcely have been undertaken by the ancients. Socrates, at least, who is credited with having put forth the physic-teleological proof for God's existence, did not go about it in any such manner. He always presupposes the God's existence, and under this presupposition seeks to interpenetrate nature with the idea of purpose. Had he been asked why he pursued this method, he would doubtless have explained that he lacked the courage to venture out upon so perilous a voyage of discovery without having made sure of the God's existence behind him. At the word of the God, he casts his net as if to catch the idea of purpose, for nature herself finds many means of frightening the inquirer and distracts him by many a digression. The paradoxical passion of the reason thus comes repeatedly into collision with this unknown, which does indeed exist, but is unknown, and in so far does not exist. The reason cannot advance beyond this point, and yet it cannot refrain in its paradoxical nest from arriving at this limit and occupying itself therewith. It will not serve to dismiss its relation to it simply by asserting that the unknown does not exist, since this itself involves a relationship. But what then is the unknown, since the designation of it as the God merely signifies for us that it is unknown? To say that it is the unknown because it cannot be known, and even if it were capable of being known, it cannot be expressed, does not satisfy the demands of passion, though it correctly interprets the unknown as a limit. But a limit is precisely a torment for passion, though it also serves as an incitement. And yet the reason can come no further, whether it risks an issue via negationist or via eminentia. What then is the unknown? It is the limit to which the reason repeatedly comes, and in so far, substituting a static form of conception for the dynamic, it is the different, the absolutely different. But because it is absolutely different, there is no mark by which it could be distinguished. When qualified as absolutely different, it seems on the verge of disclosure, but this is not the case, for the reason cannot even conceive an absolute unlikeness. The reason cannot negate itself absolutely, but uses itself for the purpose, and thus conceives only such an unlikeness within itself as it can conceive by means of itself. It cannot absolutely transcend itself, and hence conceives only such a superiority over itself as it can conceive by means of itself. Unless the unknown, the God, remains a mere limiting conception, the single idea of difference will be thrown into a state of confusion, and become many ideas of many differences. The unknown is then in a condition of dispersion, and the reason may choose at pleasure from what is at hand, and the imagination may suggest the monstrous, the ludicrous, etc. But it is impossible to hold fast to a difference of this nature. Every time this is done, it is essentially an arbitrary act, and deepest down in the heart of piety lurks the mad caprice which knows that it has itself produced the God. If no specific determination of difference can be held fast, because there is no distinguishing mark, like and unlike finally become identified with one another, thus sharing the fate of all such dialectical opposites. The unlikeness clings to the reason and confounds it, so that the reason no longer knows itself and quite consistently confuses itself with the unlikeness. On this point, paganism has been sufficiently prolific in fantastic inventions. As for the last named supposition, the self-irony of the reason, I shall attempt to delineate it merely by a stroke or two, without raising any question of its being historical. There exists an individual whose appearance is precisely like that of other men. He grows up to manhood like others, he marries, he has an occupation by which he earns his livelihood, and he makes provision for the future as befits a man. For though it may be beautiful to live like the birds of the air, it is not lawful, and may lead to the sorriest of consequences, either starvation if one has enough persistence, or dependence on the bounty of others. This man is also the God. How do I know? I cannot know it, for in order to know it I would have to know the God, and the nature of the difference between the God and man. And this I cannot know, because the reason has reduced it to likeness with that from which it was unlike. Thus, the God becomes the most terrible of deceivers, because the reason has deceived itself. The reason has brought the God as near as possible, and yet he is as far away as ever. If you cannot master yourself so as to make yourself contemporaneous with him and thus become a Christian, or if he cannot, as your contemporary, draw you to himself, then you will never be a Christian. You may, if you please, honor, praise, thank, and with all worldly goods reward him who deludes you into thinking that you are a Christian. Nevertheless, he deceives you. You may count yourself happy that you are not contemporaneous with one who dared to assert this, or you may be exasperated to madness by the torment, like that of the gadfly, of being contemporaneous with one who says this to your face. In the first case you are deceived, whereas in the second you have at least had a chance to hear the truth. If you cannot bear this contemporaneousness, and not bear to see this sight in reality, if you cannot prevail upon yourself to go out into the street and behold, it is God in that loathsome procession, and if you cannot bear to think that this will be your condition also if you kneel and worship him, then you are not essentially a Christian. In that case, what you will have to do is to admit the fact unconditionally to yourself, so that you may, above all, preserve humility and fear and trembling when contemplating what it means really to be a Christian. For that way you must proceed, in order to learn and to practice how to flee to grace, so that you will not seek it in vain, but do not, for God's sake, go to anyone to be consoled. For to be sure it is written, Blessed are the eyes which see the things that ye see. 26, which word the priests have on the tips of their tongues, curiously enough, at times, perhaps, even to defend a worldly finery which, if contemporary with Christ, would be rather incongruous as if these words had not been said solely about those contemporaries of his who believed. If his exaltation had been evident to the eyes so that everyone without any trouble could have beheld it, why then it would be incorrect to say that Christ abased himself and assumed the guise of a servant, and it would be superfluous to warn against being offended in him, for why in the world should one take offense in an exalted one arrayed in glory? And how in the world will you explain it that Christ fared so ill and that everybody failed to rush up admiringly to behold what was so plain? Ah no, he hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. Isaiah chapter 53, 2. Kierkegaard's own note, and there was to all appearances nothing remarkable about him who in lowly guise, and by performing signs and wonders, constantly presented the possibility of offence, who claimed to be God in lowly guise, which therefore expresses, in the first place, what God means by compassion, and by one's self needing to be humble and poor if one wishes to be compassionate, and in the second place, what God means by the misery of mankind, which, again, in both instances is extremely different from what men mean by these things, and which every generation, to the end of time, has to learn over again from the beginning, and beginning in every respect at the same point where those who were contemporary with Christ had to start, that is, to practice these things as contemporaries of Christ. Human impatience and unreadiness is, of course, of no avail whatsoever. No man will be able to tell you in how far you may succeed in becoming essentially a Christian, but neither will anxiety and fear and despair help one. Sincerity toward God is the first and the last condition. Sincerity in confessing to oneself just where one stands. Sincerity before God in ever aiming at one's task. However slowly one may proceed, and if it be but crawling, one is, at any rate, in the right position and is not misled and deceived by the trick of changing the nature of Christ who, instead of being God, is thereby made to represent that sentimental compassion which is man's own invention, by which men, instead of being lifted up to heaven by Christianity, are delayed on their way and remain human and no more. To those venturing into existential depths, from the silent alcove of my reflections, I have delved into the human spirit, discovering it entwined in a deep-seated emotion, anxiety. In the concept of anxiety, I explore this intricate feeling not merely as a fleeting disturbance of the psyche, but as the core of our autonomy. Envision yourself at the precipice of infinite horizons, seized by the vertiginous magnetism of forthcoming potentials. This sensation embodies the dizziness of freedom. Anxiety, esteemed readers, is born from our consciousness of possibilities, the boundless spectrum of decisions, and the gravity of their ramifications. It stands as both our boon and bane, a testament to our profound liberty and inherent limitations. In my estimation, prospective authors ought to judiciously select their themes. It behooves them to acquaint themselves with the prevailing literature on the subject. Upon discovering someone who has astutely and exhaustively tackled a facet of the matter, they should exult, much like a friend who rejoices at a bridegroom's voice. Once undertaken in seclusion and with the intensity of isolated passion, minimal remains to be accomplished. They can then pen their work as effortlessly as a bird composes its melody. If it elicits joy or aids another, it's an added gratification. Post-publication, authors should maintain humility, refraining from presuming their creation as a beacon for all epochs. Each era grapples with its dilemmas and needn't bear the onus of preceding or subsequent times. Likewise, every soul confronts their own adversities. One shouldn't bear the mantle of their epoch or assume their writing to be a historic watershed. Brandishing the globe's weight doesn't metamorphose one into Atlas. Grand proclamations don't invariably culminate in monumental accomplishments. Solely endorsing an era doesn't attest credibility. Regarding my own stance, I candidly concede that as a writer, I'm analogous to a monarch bereft of territory. In my reticence and trepidation, I stake no grand claims. Should my Latin moniker seem ostentatious, I'd readily embrace a more colloquial one. Although I defer to authority, my comprehension of its genesis is cursory, be it by fortuity, consensus, or cycle. My sole aspiration is to discern the recognized authority for any given duration. By my reckoning, every generation possesses distinct degrees of the demonic. Should our epoch reflect this median, the pieces fall into place. This muddles our grasp of Christianity, for it was a singular event when divinity incarnated as man. Determining the divine quotient for each age would elucidate matters. A medical therapeutic lens might view this phenomenon as solely physiological. Some individuals' comprehension of irony resembles the youth who, queried about the origin of raisins, retorted, "Ours are procured from the professor on Cross Street." Their deductions are drawn similarly. Now, to revert to the crux, anxiety vis-a-vis goodness. Loss of liberty might merely symbolize an interim from which nascent sin materializes. Only virtue can harmonize state and progression. When I employ the constructs of virtue and vice, they warrant abstract interpretation. If the potentiality of freedom culminates in trepidation over culpability, it signifies anxiety concerning the negation of freedom. When the demonic encapsulates anxiety about malevolence, we encounter repressed freedom yearning to actualize genuine freedom. To some, it may appear paradoxical, who, after all, would renounce freedom. Yet, one's discourse on these subjects might betray their lack of comprehension of the tumult arising when freedom morphs into confinement. Longing for freedom is elementary, given that longing may be the least emancipated act. Freedom can be squandered in myriad manners, all tied to synthesis's facets. Whether lost through base instincts, intellect, or faith, freedom's forfeiture is invariably ethical. As you traverse life's sinuous paths, recognize anxiety not as a foe but as an illuminator. It echoes your autonomy, your onus, and the perpetual ballet between the transient and the perpetual. With sincere introspection and aspirations for your enlightened sojourn, Søren Kierkegaard. To the astute reader, salvete, reader, given our postulation that 1,843 years have elapsed, bridging the contemporary disciple to this dialogical era, it might seem prima facie that we ought to contemplate the notion of a disciple at second hand. Such a relation must have been reiterated through time. Thus, the question rises to prominence, demanding we dissect both the similarities and divergences between the contemporary disciple and the disciple at second hand. However, ante omnia, might we pause to evaluate the legitimacy of this very question? If it's deemed an incongruum, a question posed in ignorance, it might render the asker liable to the charge of incipientia for not recognizing its nature. In such a scenario, our quandaries seem to vanish. Indeed, one might interject, if the question is moot, then the answer's pertinence diminishes, and the challenge becomes levisimus. But is it possible that the crux lies in discerning the very inability to pose such a question? Or perhaps you've already fathomed this. Was this your implication in our preceding discourse, Chapter 4, hinting that you had deciphered my intent and the ramifications of my proposition, even when I, mea culpa, hadn't fully grasped my own reflections? By no stretch, you might counter, nor do I advocate dismissing the query. Moreover, it beckons another. Considering the vast temporal expanse, is it equitable to bifurcate it into such disproportionate segments, the initial generation of contemporaneous disciples juxtaposed against all ensuing generations? You're alluding to the potential for classifications like disciple at fifth hand, disciple at seventh hand, and so on. But even if, ad argumentum, I were to indulge this line of reasoning, does it necessitate a detailed breakdown of each differentiation? Can they not be collectively addressed under a singular umbrella, set in opposition to the contemporary disciple? Or, perchance, does our debate risk evolving, mirroring your tactics, metamorphosing the dilemma of the disciple at second hand into an entirely distinct conundrum, thereby sidestepping my initial proposition, only to ensnare me in a newly minted quandary? However, any nos inducas in tentation of descending into a spiral of sophistry and contention, I shall have over conclude this dialogue. But in the ensuing exposition, dear reader, you shall discern that our interchange has not gone unnoticed. Verum laudire volo, you might exclaim. Having journeyed through your discourse, and indeed with no modest intrigue, I've noted the absence of catchwords and hidden scripts. Yet, like the lapsus lingua that inadvertently reveals one's true intentions, you consistently weave in familiar phrases that awaken dormant memories. Your notion, suggesting it's advantageous for the disciple when the God departs the earth, is borrowed from the New Testament, specifically from the Gospel of John. Whether this is a deliberate design on your part, or a desire to lend gravitas to this idea by cloaking it in such a form, the essence seems to diminish the privilege of being contemporary with the event. Your discourse suggests that this immediacy might be more a transient phase, essential indeed to the narrative, but without absolute significance to the contemporary. In essence, the contemporary loses nothing by its cessation, but might even profit. Absent this phase, however, he loses everything and reverts to the Socratic order. To which I respond, optime dictum, if humility permitted. For your words echo my sentiments. Indeed, being immediately contemporary isn't an unequivocal boon. This becomes transparent upon introspection, devoid of the fleeting allure of novelty. As long as one isn't swayed by the urgency of declaring groundbreaking revelations, like the Grecian barber of yore, and as long as one doesn't naively view such a proclamation as a martyr's testament. The immediacy of contemporaneity isn't an asset. Rather, the contemporary might wish for its cessation to avoid the temptation of mere sensory experiences, which are futile and potentially perilous endeavors. These reflections, as you've astutely noted, belong to another facet of our discussion, centering on the advantages a contemporary believer might glean post his conversion. Here, our focus narrows on how immediacy facilitates this conversion. A successor is spared from this temptation, for he relies solely on the testimonies of the contemporaries. If he is discerning, he'd hope that such testimonies aren't so prolific as to drown out the essence, lest they become libri sign fine, innumerable volumes that the world can scarcely contain. The immediate contemporaneity carries a turbulence that settles only when the proclamation declares, consummatum est. But the succeeding tranquillity must not be such as to do away with the historical, for then everything will be Socratic. In this manner, then equality seems to have been achieved, and the differences between the parties involved brought back to a fundamental likeness. Such is also my opinion, but you should take into consideration the fact that it is the God himself who effects the reconciliation. Is it thinkable that the God would enter into a covenant with a few, such that this their covenant with him established a difference between them and all other men so unjust as to cry to heaven for vengeance? That would be to bring strife instead of peace. Is it conceivable that the God would permit an accident of time to decide to whom he would grant his favor? Or is it not rather worthy of the God to make his covenant with men equally difficult for every human being in every time and place? Equally difficult, since no man is able to give himself the condition, nor yet is to receive it from another, thus introducing new strife. Equally difficult, but also equally easy, since the God grants the condition. This is why I looked upon my project in the beginning as a godly one, in so far as an hypothesis can be viewed in this light, and still so consider it, though not on that account being indifferent to any human objection. On the contrary, I now ask you once more, if you have any valid objection, to bring it forward. How festive you suddenly become! Even if the case did not demand it, one would almost have to make some objection for the sake of the festiveness, unless it should be regarded as more festive to omit it, and your solemn challenge is merely intended indirectly to enjoin silence. Whether the nature of the objection may at least be such as not to disturb this festive mood, I will draw it from the festivity by which it seems to me that a later generation will distinguish itself from the contemporary generation. I recognize indeed that the contemporary generation must profoundly feel and suffer the pain entailed by the coming into being of such a paradox, or as you have put it, the God's implantation of himself in human life. But gradually the new order of things will presumably struggle its way through to victory, and then at last will come the happy generation which garners with songs of joy the fruits of the seed sowed in the first generation with so many tears. Now this triumphant generation, which passes through life with song and clang, is surely different from the first and earlier ones. Aye, undoubtedly it is different, and perhaps so different as not to retain the resemblance which makes it necessary for us to take it into consideration. It may be lacking in the condition which could cause its difference to disconcert our efforts to establish equality. But consider a triumphant generation, which goes through life, as you say, with song and clang, by which, if my memory does not fail me, you intend to remind me of the sophomoric and ale Norse translation of a scripture passage by a not unknown genius. Can this generation actually be a believing generation? Verily, if faith ever gets the notion of marching forward triumphantly en masse, it will not be necessary to license the singing of songs of mockery, for it would not help to forbid it all. Even if men were stricken dumb, this mad procession would draw upon itself a shrill laughter, like the mocking nature tones on the island of Ceylon, for a faith that celebrates its triumph is the most ridiculous thing conceivable. If the contemporary generation of believers found no time to triumph, neither will any later generation, for the task is always the same, and faith is always militant. But as long as there is struggle, there is always a possibility of defeat, and with respect to faith it is their full well not to triumph before the time, that is to say, in time, for when will there be found time to compose songs of triumph or occasion to sing them? If such a thing were to happen, it would be as if an army drawn up in battle array, instead of marching forward to meet the enemy, were to march home again in triumph to their barracks in the city. Even if no human being laughed at this, even if the entire contemporary generation sympathized with this abracadabra, would not the stifled laughter of the universe break forth where it was least expected? What would the behavior of such a so-called believer be but an intensification of the offense committed by the contemporary believer? Compare chapter 2, who begged of the God, in vain, since the God would not that he refrained from exposing himself to humiliation and contempt. For this later so-called believer was not only himself unwilling to bear humiliation and contempt, unwilling to strive as the world's full, but was willing to believe when this could be done with song and clang. To such a man the God will not, nay cannot say, as to the contemporary in question, and so you love only the omnipotent wonder-worker, but not him who humbled himself to become your equal. But here I will break off. Even if I were a better dialectician than I am, there would still be a limit to my powers. At bottom it is an immovable firmness with respect to the absolute, and with respect to absolute distinctions, that makes a man a good dialectician. This is something that our age has altogether overlooked, in and by its repudiation of the principle of contradiction, failing to perceive what Aristotle nevertheless pointed out, namely that the proposition, the principle of contradiction is annulled, itself rests upon the principle of contradiction, since otherwise the opposite proposition, that it is not annulled, is equally true. One further remark I wish to make, however, with respect to your many animadversions, all pointing to my having introduced borrowed expressions in the course of my exposition. That such is the case I do not deny, nor will I now conceal from you that it was done purposely, and that in the next section of this piece, if I ever write such a section, it is my intention to call the whole by its right name, and to clothe the problem in its historical costume. If I ever write a next section, for an author of pieces such as I am has no seriousness of purpose, as you will doubtless hear said about me, why then should I now at the end feign a seriousness I do not have, in order to please men by making what is perhaps a great promise? It is a frivolous matter, namely, to write a piece, but to promise the system as a serious thing. Many a man has become serious both in his own eyes and in those of others by making such a promise. However, what the historical costume of the following section will be is not hard to see. It is well known that Christianity is the only historical phenomenon which, in spite of the historical, nay, precisely by means of the historical, has intended itself to be for the single individual the point of departure for his eternal consciousness, has intended to interest him otherwise than merely historically, has intended to base his eternal happiness on his relationship to something historical. No system of philosophy, addressing itself only to thought, no mythology, addressing itself solely to the imagination, no historical knowledge, addressing itself to the memory, has ever had this idea, of which it may be said with all possible ambiguity in this connection, that it did not arise in the heart of any man. But this is something I have to a certain extent wished to forget, and, making use of the unlimited freedom of an hypothesis, have assumed that the whole was a curious conceit of my own, which I did not wish to abandon, however, until I had thought it through. The monks never finished telling the history of the world because they always began with the creation. Yet in dealing with the relations between philosophy and Christianity, we begin by first recounting what has previously been said. How will it ever be possible, not to finish but to begin? For history continues to grow. If we have to begin first with that great thinker and sage, Executor Novi Testamenti, Pontius Pilate, who in his own way has been of considerable service to Christianity and to philosophy, even if he did not discover the principle of mediation, and if before beginning with him we must wait for one or another decisive contribution, perhaps the system, for which the bans have several times already been published ex cathedra. In that case, how will we ever come to begin? Conclusion. Søren Kierkegaard, the eminent Danish philosopher and theologian, held the concept of the leap of faith as the linchpin in discerning human existence and its communion with God. As a cornerstone in existentialist thought, it accentuates Kierkegaard's voyage into the enigmatic essence of religious conviction. Kierkegaard credo quia absurdum est. Kierkegaard believed that some truths, notably religious ones, stand outside the purview of empirical corroboration and logical inference. To truly fathom such truths, one must undertake a saltus fide, a leap into the abyss of the unknown, stemming from pure ardor and allegiance rather than empirical assurance. This leap is no mere caprice, it is a deliberate choice to embrace religious enigma in the face of the ineffable. The biblical narrative of Abraham's readiness to sacrifice Isaac serves as a fulcrum for Kierkegaard's thought. Abraham's unwavering intent to obey God, devoid of logical rationale, epitomizes this leap of faith. It is a capitulation to the sublime, a poignant affirmation of belief nestled in the chasm between certainty and mystery. In summa, Kierkegaard's saltus fide underscores the notion that authentic faith surmounts rational confines. It is a deliberate, fervent dive into conviction, cognizant of inherent ambiguities, exemplifying the multifaceted human soul in its pilgrimage for significance and divine union. Ad literam, o inculae occidentalis moderni. From my temporal cloister, I've beheld your epoch, replete with technological wonders and a surfeit of knowledge. Yet, amidst such proliferation, I ponder if the quintessence of human existence is overshadowed by a ceaseless maelstrom of diversions. You dwell in the proclaimed eaters rationis, the digital eon, where curiositas meets elucidation with mere gestures. But num scientia sapientium parat. Amid your interwoven web of discourses, the quintessential query endures. Do you truly commune with your inner essence, with the sacrosanct? Beware the peril of conflating data with discernment, of viewing existence solely through the prism of the palpable. The introspective journey, the internal whirlwind of fervor, desolation, and faith, risks being silenced by the allure of quantifiable truths. Recall, amici, faith isn't an enigma to be unraveled, but a tension to be lived. It often dwells not in lucidity, but in obscurity. The leap of faith I elucidated isn't merely a voyage into dogma, but a descent into one's very essence, grappling with life's inherent paradoxes. I exhort you, be not mere onlookers of life, relegated to digital vistas. Engage, challenge, immerse. Embrace the nebulous, for therein lies the sanctum of genuine liberty. In this vertiginous world, perhaps the urgency to introspect intensifies. Question not merely, quid sio, but qui sum, and quid credo. Endeavor not only to comprehend the cosmos, but to fathom your locus within, for therein the flames of passion, purpose, and faith are ignited. In spe profundere votis pro vestra introspectione. Soren Kierkegaard.
Until our narratives intertwine once more, I remain Tim, wishing you insightful journeys. Brace for tomorrow, for with it comes another chapter in the annals of Treaty of Peace and the Reactionaries. Farewell until we reconvene.